Chapter 141, Rhodes vs. Chingy, Part 1. Chingy hovered a few paces from Nethan Rhodes, his expression as cold and unfeeling as the frost that already clung to the ground beneath them. A slow exhalation escaped him, and in an instant the air around them crystallized into a bone-chilling mist. "You've grown faster than most expected," Chingy murmured, his voice drifting like a winter wind. "But standing before me now, no matter what you do, you cannot change how this ends." Before Nethan could reply, Chingy sprang upward. His arms crossed at his chest and then elongated into two massive, razor-sharp icicles. With a single fluid motion, he hurled them down toward Nethan. "Ice Scepter!" Chingy intoned. The translucent weapons screamed through the frosty air. Even at a glance, it was clear this display of speed and power was more than mere theatrics, yet Nethan's face remained perfectly calm. His eyes tracked the falling shards, yet he did not flinch. Instead, he took two precise steps back, sliding just out of their deadly path. "A few of your friends have already fled," Chingy taunted, frost glittering in his gaze, "and you won't escape either." With that, Chingy tapped into the final refinement of his cultivation, the lunar step. He hovered, legs crossed, then pivoted in midair, readying a second assault. Realizing he could not sidestep in time, Nethan pivoted on his heel, drawing on all his strength for a counterstrike. He cocked his arm and swung a backhand punch. Boom! The crack of impact echoed like thunder. Nethan's fist struck Chingy's chest, and a shockwave of cold energy rippled outward. Ice splintered from Chingy's armor, shards scattering across the frozen ground. But Chingy's form remained unbroken. His eyes flickered with surprise, and something darker, more dangerous, before he caught himself in the air and prepared to retaliate. The clash of frost and force had only just begun. Nethan's gravity-warping fist and Chingy's ice-forged blow met in midair with a deafening crack. Nethan unleashed the full force of his twisting power, aiming to pulverize Chingy in a single strike. But Chingy's face remained unreadable. Drawing on the frozen fruit's chilling energy and the domineering aura of his high-level martial color, he countered with a bone-freezing cold that surged into Nethan's arm. For a heartbeat, their powers locked, then with a thunderous boom, Nethan's twisting energy snapped. He was sent hurtling backward, spinning head over heels. Mid-air, he reasserted control over gravity and activated his moonstep technique. Pushing off an invisible current, he shot across the battlefield, putting as much distance between himself and Chingy as he could. Chingy watched him go, expression still stone-cold. Then, without hesitation, he raised a boot and stomped the ground. Instantly, a vast wall of ice, hundreds of meters long and wide, burst upward, sealing off Nethan's path. Nethan's eyes burned with determination. Twisting gravity once more around his body, he carved a perfect parabolic arc through the air and rocketed skyward, leaving the ice barrier and Chingy's inscrutable stare far below. Before Nethan could break free from the impassable ice wall, Chingy's figure blurred across the moonlit deck. In a heartbeat, she landed on the frozen barrier above him and with a single palm drove him to the ground. "Ice meteorite," she cried. Almost instantly, a colossal sphere of ice hundreds of meters across materialized overhead, hurtling toward Nethan with cataclysmic force. Its shadow swept over him, and before he could dodge, the frozen behemoth slammed him downward, sending him hurtling toward the deck below. "Vector distortion!" Nethan roared. He pressed both hands against the tumbling ice sphere, twisting its very vectors to the extreme. The sphere's gravity shifted, veering off course, and collided with the towering ice wall instead of him. Boom! The three-masted ship trembled as though struck by an earthquake. Every soul aboard felt their eardrums throb while the expansive seer-like wall cracked apart, flinging jagged shards of ice in all directions. Before the mist of shattered ice could clear, Chingy had already slipped in beside Nethan. Her forearm had crystallized into a gleaming white block of ice, and she clamped it around his arm with relentless force. Nethan hitched his shoulders and crossed his arms in front of him, and before he could tighten his stance, a single, ear-splitting blast sent him flying. He crashed through the brittle ice, shattering it beneath him like glass. Cold shards bit into his back. He spat out blood and staggered upright, coughing violently. A jagged frost pattern crept up his forearm, each breath rattling in his lungs. Until now, Nethan had always dictated the pace of battle with his twist fruit powers, striking first, striking hard. But today, it was he who'd been cornered, his abilities nullified, his muscles sluggish, his speed useless. The only advantage left was the mutable nature of his fruit. It bent and warped matter itself. "Ice burst," he roared. He whipped his arm forward. The icy scales that clung to his skin peeled away under the surge of twisting energy. Nethan thrust both hands into the frozen earth, channeling every last shred of power into the ground. A web of cracks radiated outward in an instant, running hundreds of meters in every direction. With a thunderous roar, the ice bed exploded, disgorging colossal shards into the sky. Frozen battlements tumbled and reformed midair, then rained down like artillery upon Qingji. Seizing the chaotic moment, Nethan didn't pause to watch the impact. He spun and bolted, his chest heaving, putting as much distance between himself and the freezing onslaught as he could. Nethan's only thought was to get away. Even Luffy's own stunned protege, who'd crossed swords with a general on the Chambord Islands, had chosen to flee rather than fight. Nethan, acutely aware of the vast gulf between his power and Qingji's, had already decided the same. Qingji stood unmoved, watching the cracked earth and the huge shards of ice and rubble hurtling in his direction. He exhaled softly, indifference flickering across his eyes, then lifted his hand and pressed it down. Crack! Pop! In an instant, his arm transformed into a column of interlocking ice blocks that shot forward, freezing every fragment of ice and stone in midair. With a sharp push, he sent those now solid slabs, some nearly 1,000 feet long, barreling straight at Nethan. Nethan didn't pause to retaliate. He sprang forward, feet dancing through a blur of shaved steps, moon strides, and gravity-defying twists. Like an arrow skimming low over the ground, he surged into the distance, but Qingji was even quicker. A deafening roar ripped through the earth beneath Nethan's feet. He skidded to a halt as a towering wall of ice erupted from the ground, sealing off his only escape. Nethan surged upward as he had before, but a colossal ice block, nearly 1,000 meters high, plummeted down like a fragment of shattered earth, sealing off every possible escape. He stared at the monstrous slab, grit his teeth, and slammed his feet into the ground. The earth beneath him buckled, cracked, and twisted as he tunneled downward. Boom! The giant ice block struck the surface with earth-shaking force. Though Nethan had burrowed off to one side, the shockwave ripped through the ground and tore toward him. Summoning the full extent of his distortion power, he braced himself to absorb the blow. For a moment, it seemed he might hold, but then Qingji appeared overhead, drawing on the power of the ice fruit. A wave of frosty energy scorched into the earth. Crack! Snap! Nethan managed to deflect much of the impact, but he could not fully withstand Qingji's freezing power. In an instant, his body stilled and hardened. He was encased in solid ice, frozen in place like a statue. The subterranean chamber Nethan had carved with his distortion power gave way in an instant. The earth buckled around them, ice and shattered rock raining down through the void. For a heartbeat, Qingji's form remained locked in frozen stasis. Then, as if waking from a trance, the ice sheath around her began to melt, thin tendrils of frosty air spiraling outward as warmth crept back into her limbs. She exhaled, her breath crystallizing in the air, and fixed her eyes on the fractured surface below. 1, 2, 3, and then 5 seconds after the collapse, a network of cracks raced across the ice like a spider's web. In a single, thunderous explosion of shifting slabs, the floor gave way. Through the opening, Nethan burst free. He stumbled forward, his clothes stained with blood and frosting his skin, as though he'd waded through a blizzard. Wherever frost did not cling, fresh gashes and lacerations bled freely down his arms, chest, and legs. He fought to steady himself, each breath coming in ragged gasps, pale tendrils of mist trailing from his lips. Dark, raw bruises marred his flesh, evidence of the distortion power's savage recoil when he'd overextended it. Qingji watched him silently, her expression unreadable. And then Nethan's eyes flickered, a wild light kindling somewhere in the pain. Against every expectation, a crooked smile curved his lips as he pushed himself upright, ready for whatever would come next. I'd be happy to help. Please paste in the full text of the chapter you'd like rewritten, and I'll craft a coherent, idiomatic English version, with the hero renamed to Nethan and clearly presented as male. Chapter 142, Distorted Burst of Light, Part 2. Qingji's eyes flickered, and he slowly shook his head. His mind has gone astray, he murmured. A man consumed by such conviction is dangerously unpredictable. Left unchecked, he could very well turn into a Shichibukai like Doflamingo, master of every dark transaction under the sun, or even ascend to the rank of the most reviled Yonko. Either way, we cannot allow Rhodes to slip through our fingers today. Across the courtyard, Nethin offered a thin, blood-smeared smile. You really think that's the only outcome? His voice rang clear, devoid of fear. Qingji stiffened. Guards tightened their grips on their weapons, ready to strike. But Nethin simply stood there, chest heaving, eyes burning with defiance. You call it justice, Nethin continued, voice low and steady. Your justice of the Navy, your government cloaked in darkness. You sort pirates into two neat categories, heroes, like the Straw Hats, and villains who burn, kill, and plunder. But I don't care about your labels. I refuse to choose between your good and your evil. He took a step forward, face smeared with blood but set with unwavering resolve. If I'm to go astray, let me do so against your so-called justice. You branded me evil, forced your ideals on me, and cast me into the shadows. Very well. If darkness is what you see, then I will embrace it on my own terms. A tense silence fell. The guards shifted, unsure whether to attack or retreat. Qingji's jaw tightened, shadows dancing in his eyes. In that charged moment, the line between justice and tyranny blurred, and a new light, twisted and determined, burst forth from Nethin's defiance. Since both the government and the Navy have branded him a villain, he'll embrace that title and become the real evil they'll tremble before. Qingji's face went still. Arguing with someone so unyielding was pointless. Justice isn't upheld by words but by power. In the next instant, he vanished. When he reappeared, he was already standing before Nethin, his right hand erupting into a massive frost fist. With a roar, he unleashed the blow. Nethin, spirit awakened, met the assault head-on. Though Qingji moved with terrifying speed, Nethin governed the fight with sheer force of will. He brought his own fists up, colliding with the frost fist in a crash of energy. Ice shards scattered, and Qingji's frost fist shattered, barely slowing him, while Nethin was sent flying through the air. He skidded across the ground and came to a halt on his back, winded but alive. Even now, Nethin sensed that Qingji had held back. This was the same man who, in legend, could freeze an entire island and lock the seas between landmasses in ice for a week. Accept defeat? The thought never crossed his mind. Raising himself to the ground might have been the price, but Nethin's spirit blazed on. He hauled himself to his feet, fists clenched, ready to prove that words mean nothing without the strength to back them up, and that he would never bow to a label, however dark. Nethin refused to yield. His strength might still trail Admiral Qingji's, but he was far more powerful than any Straw Hat pirate who'd set foot on the Chambord archipelago. As long as a spark of hope remained, he would fight on. Clenching his teeth, Nethin unleashed his twisted sonic boom. A roaring shockwave tore through the air toward Qingji, but the Admiral was ready. In an instant, his ears crystallized into frost and ice, absorbing the blast and leaving him unharmed. Qingji let out a frosty chuckle. Is that the best you can do? He taunted, exhaling a plume of icy air as he charged. Nethin didn't flinch. As Qingji closed in, his eyes ignited with blinding light, pure, searing radiance that struck the Admiral like a laser. Qingji reeled, blinded and twisting in agony. Seizing the moment, Nethin drove a savage kick between Qingji's ribs and stomach, flipping him head over heels. The Admiral crashed to the ground, stunned and disoriented. Hovering above his fallen opponent, Nethin's chest heaved with determination. On. There would be no retreat this time. Nethin's wounds knit almost as soon as they opened, and in the next heartbeat, he was back on his feet, surging forward in pursuit of Qingji. With a blur of motion, he closed in and unleashed a rapid-fire fusillade of ice shards. Each blast struck Qingji, spraying fractured ice across the frozen field, until one final punch sent him sprawling onto the hard glacial surface. Nethin didn't pause. Channeling the moon step and his gravity twist technique, he vaulted skyward, aiming to slip unnoticed into the swirling mist. But at nearly 100 meters distance, he froze. Qingji had already regained his footing. A thin trickle of blood stained the corner of his lips, and his eyes, cold as winter's heart, tracked Nethin's ascent without a flicker of fear. Qingji's arms shot out, each motion carving through the air like twin blades of ice. Tendrils of frost curled around his limbs, forming crystalline skates of shimmering white. With brutal speed, he slashed at Nethan high above the frozen ground. Nethan twisted sideways, heart pounding, narrowly evading that deadly frost edge as he continued to climb toward the fog, the duel far from over. Nethan felt the air grow impossibly cold the moment Qingji pushed his frost fruit ability to its limit. Overhead, countless ice cubes materialized and fused into razor-sharp spears, then plummeted like a violent hailstorm. Nethan glanced around. The sea of mist offered no clear lines of sight, and even his formidable perception had its bounds. Only a handful of people in the world could blanket an entire island like Anilu with sheer presence. If he could slip just outside Qingji's sensory range, he might buy himself a chance to escape. The first spears struck, and Nethan met them with a flurry of punches, shattering the ice on impact. Still, more continued to fall. With a sudden burst of speed, Qingji closed in, landing atop Nethan's shoulders. With a single, crushing sweep of his leg, he drove the remaining spears downward and struck Nethan in the ribs. Nethan retaliated with a desperate punch, but Qingji's power was overwhelming. The blow rattled through him, and he was sent sprawling across the misty ground. As he struggled to rise, he caught sight of a towering icicle forming above him, its tip aimed squarely at his heart. "Icicle!" Qingji roared, ready for the finishing blow. Qingji hovered in midair, arms folded, his expression cold and unyielding. Suddenly his entire body solidified into a massive, razor-sharp icicle and drove downward with crushing force. The spear of ice struck Nethan, driving him headlong toward the frozen ground. With a thunderous impact, he slammed onto the ice. Nethan hit the surface with bone-shaking force, but thanks to his innate distortion power and the overwhelming strength of his battle aura, much of the collision was absorbed. Even so, the blow left him reeling. Blood welled at the corner of his mouth, and every muscle screamed in protest. A member of the Endurance clan gifted with the tenacity talent, Nethan normally excelled at withstanding punishment, but repeated, devastating strikes had already pushed him to the brink. Jagged fragments of shattered ice pinned him to the ground, each shard an agonizing reminder of how vulnerable he'd become. Gasping for air, Nethan's vision swam. He fought to clear his head, desperately weighing every possible advantage. One more attack like that would leave him critically wounded, unable to heal, and stripped of any hope of escape. With his strength already faltering, he knew he had to find an opening, fast, or this fight would be his last. Nethan's mind raced with idea after idea, each one igniting and then vanishing in an instant, until only a single thought remained. If this was truly the only way, then he had to try. He drew in a steadying breath and turned his gaze to Qingji, who lay collapsed just a few paces away. A determined calm settled over him as the light in his eyes froze into resolute stillness. Chapter 143, Awakening, Part 3. Every time he'd taken a heavy blow in that fight, the twisting power inside Nethan writhed more fiercely, until now, when it threatened to tear free of his skin. He hated leaving his fate to chance, yet here he was, relying on luck as wildly as Fujitora's coin flip. One wrong turn, and everything would be lost. Qingji lay momentarily stunned on the ground, but then he lifted his right arm, and it transformed in an instant into a phantom bird of frost. The icy creature dove toward Nethan with terrifying speed, freezing the air around it into glittering shards. Nethan steadied himself, drew in a shuddering breath, and pressed his palms together as if gripping something invisible. "Twisted impact," he roared. The distortion energy coalesced between his hands, warping the surrounding air into a churning vortex. He thrust forward, slamming the attack into the icy bird's head. Crack! Crack! The sound of fracturing ice echoed in the air as Nethan's twisting power erupted in a relentless surge. Every nerve in his body screamed with exhilaration. He had tapped the very limit of his strength, and beyond it. Nethan's ice bird shrieked as it slammed into the crusher's maw, its head shattering inch by inch. Within moments, the creature collapsed into a cascade of crushed ice, shards spraying in every direction. Nethan drew in a frosty breath, and at the very instant the last fragment fell away, he advanced. His arm crystallized into a jagged icicle, and with a feral cry he thrust it at Rhodes. A wave of freezing air rippled from the spike, racing across Rhodes's armor and coating it in a lacy frost. Rhodes grunted, drawing on his distortion magic with every ounce of will. The impact drove him backward, step by grinding step, until the ice beneath his boots exploded in deep cracks like a plow cutting through frozen earth. Each footfall widened the chasms under him, sending glittering shards skittering outward. But Rhodes would not yield. His distortion energy boiled over, rippling beneath his skin. Gathering that raw power between his palms, he met Nethin's icicle blow for blow in a blinding collision of elemental might. It was like two iron springs being squeezed ever tighter, each opposing force threatening to snap under the intolerable pressure. For a heartbeat, they stood locked in that contest, and distortion, cold, and chaos, each testing the other's limit. And as the shards of frozen ground trembled around them, it became clear neither would break first. Nethin's body, honed by relentless daily conditioning, core-strengthening drills, and the raw tenacity unlocked by his freshly awakened talent, had become like a coiled spring. Every ounce of his training wound that spring tighter and tighter, pushing it toward its absolute limit without ever snapping. This, in essence, was the true meaning of a devil fruit awakening. With an animal-type fruit, one's physique and regenerative power climb to superhuman heights. With a superhuman type, that power surges outward, no longer confined by the flesh, but able to shape the very world around it. Mastering the transition from inside to outside was both the most crucial step and the hardest to achieve, rarer even than the mythical beast fruits themselves. Now, under the sheer crushing force of Qingji's attack, Nithin's coiled resilience was tested like never before. Blow after blow, his body held firm, the tension peaking, stretching every fiber of his strength. And then, in a heartbeat, pop! The spring finally released its pent-up power in an explosive burst. The moment everything changed, Nethin felt something stir deep within him, the first true awakening of his devil fruit power. A feral scream burst from his lips as every ounce of his repressed strength exploded outward through his palms. The very air around him twisted into a roaring vortex, a spiraling storm that tore apart ice, earth, and air alike with savage force. Qingji's eyes widened. He'd been taken aback by Nethin's earlier shockwave and blinding burst of light, but he'd chalked those off as tricks one might expect from someone of Nethin's caliber. This was something else entirely. At his apparent limit, Nethin had unleashed a level of power so far beyond expectation that Qingji could scarcely believe it. The vortex bore down on him like a living thing. Without hesitation, Qingji summoned his armament haki to its fullest extent, crossing his arms before him in a solid obsidian shield. The wind howled, jagged shards of ice splintered off in every direction, and dust and debris swirled into the air as the two forces collided. For what felt like an eternity, neither man gave ground. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, the choking pressure eased. The storm unraveled. Ice shattered, falling to the ground like glittering gems, and the dust settled, revealing a battlefield transformed by the force of their clash. Silence fell, broken only by Nethin's ragged breathing and the distant crackle of dissipating energy. In that moment, both combatants understood. Nothing would ever be the same again. Between Nethin and Admiral Qingji lay a swath of frozen earth tens of meters wide, heaved and gouged as if some titanic force had swallowed it whole. In truth, the ground formed a twisted cylinder, crushed by immense pressure and reduced to powdered debris. Devil fruit? Awakening? As a Navy admiral, Qingji recognized the signs immediately. No other explanation could account for the sudden, overwhelming power Nethin had just unleashed, power that warped the very landscape around him, than the true awakening of his devil fruit. If Nethin had accessed this level of strength sooner, Qingji mused, he might have endured several more of my attacks, forcing me to go all out earlier. This awakening was exactly what Qingji had feared and expected. Nethin himself stood at the edge of the circular devastation and breathed deeply. A rush of exhilaration surged through every fiber of his being, as if his pores had come alive. Like a fish finally released into open water, he felt truly free. This was the moment his devil fruit had truly come into its own. Nethin could almost feel his devil fruit power break free from his body, surging outward like an untamed storm. No longer shackled to flesh, his ability now rippled through the air, ready to reshape reality itself. He offered a silent nod of gratitude to whatever force had guided him this far. Finally, things were getting interesting. He blinked and met General Qingji's steely gaze. Blood crusted at the corners of his mouth, but on his lips played a faint, almost cold smile. Without Qingji's relentless pressure, Nethan knew he might have spent years more struggling to compress and rebound his latent strength. There was no denying it. Combat at its most desperate was the crucible of true potential. Qingji's face hardened. He hadn't anticipated such a swift transformation. Even with Nethan's devil fruit awakened, the general of Navy headquarters still commanded this battlefield, until now. A fierce light ignited in Nethan's eyes. In a heartbeat, he coiled like a spring and exploded forward. His right arm shot out, fingers splayed like blades, slicing through the charged air toward Qingji with lethal precision. A glowing sphere flickered into existence at Nethan's fingertips, far more translucent than the trembling fruit he'd held, its surface traced by a slender arc of light. In the next instant, it detonated. Boom! A wave of distorting energy slammed into Qingji, ripping the earth and air into jagged fractures. Qingji's eyes narrowed. He pressed his palms together, summoning the frozen fruit's power. In an instant, a colossal wall of ice shot up between them, intercepting the rift-like blast. Crack! The warping force pounded the ice, bending it inward until it collapsed in a shower of jagged shards. Qingji braced for Nethan's next assault, only to see his opponent turn and flee, vanishing into the distance without a backward glance. A cold smirk curved Qingji's lips. Even bearing the scars of countless battles, Nethan had never truly stood a chance against him. Without the fruit's awakened power, their gulf of strength was simply insurmountable. He merely wields a combat ability comparable to Doflamingo's. Chapter 144, Alive, Part 4. Nethan's gambit had caught her off guard. Qingji's jaw snapped shut in annoyance, and she surged forward without hesitation. Yet before she'd gone more than a dozen paces, the ice beneath her feet split in a jagged line, as if two great plates of the earth were tearing apart, one heaving upward, the other sinking in reply. It was Rhodes's remote trigger at work. By the time the fracture snapped back into place, Nethan's figure was swallowed by the thick, swirling fog. All that remained was the faint quiver in the air where he'd just been, an imperceptible ripple of warped space growing more distant by the second. "Don't even think about running away," Qingji snarled, her voice low and dangerous. Since awakening his devil fruit power, Nethan had come to wield distortion force at a distance just as Whitebeard once did, and with far greater potency. He could twist gravity itself, bending it to speed himself up or slow his foes to a crawl. Cloaked in the moonwalk technique, he moved with a blurred grace that nearly matched Qingji's full-bore thrust. Why that slight lag in his pace? Because Qingji's version of moonwalk wasn't purely ethereal. Every time she landed a step, a perfect cube of ice crystallized in midair beneath her boot. Those floating platforms gave her explosive thrust and unshakable footing, advantages Nethan's ghost-like strides simply couldn't replicate. Through the rolling haze, every distortion in the mist marked where Nethan had been. Beneath Qingji's relentless onrush, a chain of pale blue ice blocks flickered into existence, each one a stepping stone in her pursuit. And so, across that fractured ice field, predator and prey raced on, one cloaked in shifting gravity, the other smashing glacial steps in her wake, both determined to land the next strike first. A few tense moments earlier, Qingji had grown furious. Their mission was clear, to wipe out the ghost hand pirates at sea, yet Lafitte and the others had slipped away, and now Nethan was vanishing too. He wouldn't stand for it. In an instant, the two of them tore free from under the looming three-masted pirate ship, plunging into the swirling mist. Qingji's pace was still marginally faster, but Nethan's ability to manipulate his corsair threads from a distance gave him plenty of breathing room. He didn't need a head-to-head clash to keep Qingji at bay. Their chase carried them deeper into the gray haze until, finally, both figures vanished without a trace. Several days later, the sea was nothing but a boundless carpet of fog. Adrift on its surface was a ramshackle raft of timber, roughly 4 or 5 meters wide, 7 or 8 meters long, creaking as it bobbed toward an uncertain fate. On that fragile float, 3 figures passed the time however they could. In one corner sat Luo Zheng, hunched over his demon-etched knife, its blade glinting in the dim light. Beside him, Robin rested quietly, eyes half closed, keeping watch. And at the very edge of the raft, Lafitte stood poised with his elegant mahogany cane, dangling a length of fishing line over the side. Every so often, he'd laugh, a low, mirthless sound, at the lines that never quite snagged a single fish. No one spoke about the chase anymore. For now, they simply drifted, each lost in his own thoughts, as the raft carried them ever onward through the fog-shrouded sea. Lafitte jabbed his mahogany cane into the dark sea. In one smooth motion, the polished tip sliced through the water and skewered a darting fish. Immediately, he summoned a flicker of flame to scorch the catch, then set to work gutting and filleting it. It had been 3 grueling days since they'd escaped the horror bark. Robin and Luo had finally thawed out. The cold had nearly claimed them both. Their rations were holding up, but fresh water was all but gone. Luo propped himself up on an elbow and spoke in a hoarse whisper. "With what strength I have left, I can purify just enough water for the 3 of us," he admitted. "It won't last forever, but it'll keep us alive. Now we just have to hope Captain Nethen finds us soon." Lafitte shrugged as he sliced through the fish's backbone. Robin reached into his tunic, produced a small ivory card, and let it float between cupped hands. The life card glowed softly, a sliver of Nethen's vital essence, meant to drift steadily toward him. Robin's brow furrowed as he watched it. "It hasn't budged in hours," he said. "It should be pulling us toward the captain's location, but right now, it's held completely still." After capturing CP9, Rhodes had special life card materials brought aboard. He used them to create cards for himself, Robin, Luo, and Lafitte, while Siru made one of her own. Each of those 5 cards was then cut into 4 identical pieces, labeled with the bearer's name, and distributed among the crew, so that anyone could track a comrade's vital signs and bearing at a glance. Siru's card was utterly destroyed and vanished without a trace. Nethen's, by contrast, had been half ruined a few days earlier, but then stopped deteriorating and held steady. In the days that followed, the little directional needle on Nethen's card swung back and forth, signaling that his orientation kept changing, most likely because he was tangled up with Qingji. Then, exactly 4 hours ago, the needle froze. At that point, only 2 possibilities remained. Nethen was either staying completely still, or he was heading straight for us. Either way, Rhodes was out of danger. "It looks like our captain really did take care of the Admiral," Lafitte murmured, a self-satisfied smile curling at the corners of his mouth. "He's more than earned that title, ho 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 ho. Having a captain who can shake off an admiral's pursuit is exhilarating. It means we still have some teeth in these waters. Yet today we failed outright." Robin's slender fingers curled around Nethen's life card, her expression taut with frustration as she exhaled softly. "Ghost Shadow's frozen solid, an ice sculpture courtesy of Qingji. We might thaw it eventually, but it'll be useless for striking terror into anyone's heart." Laying the shattered fragments of Shilu's life card on the table, she continued, "And Shilu, the ripped-to-shreds card, tells me he died by Qingji's hand. As for the rest of the crew and hired hands, either they were cut down by Qingji or dragged off by the Navy." Luo Chen, who had been sitting quietly across from her, leaned forward. His tone was calm, almost resigned. "We got away alive. Escaping an admiral is victory enough, in my book." Lafitte let a slow, wry grin spread across his face. "That's a good way to look at it. The fish may have gotten away today, but the hook's still baited. We'll have another shot." They shared a short, tense silence before gathering their scattered maps and charts. Outside the cabin, the mist lay thick over the sea. Inside, the 3 pirates settled back into uneasy repose, drifting with the fog, each lost in his own thoughts. No one could say how long they'd been floating, only that tomorrow would bring another chance. A dark silhouette materialized in the swirling fog, drifting silently toward the ship. Lafitte instinctively raised his cane in a defensive salute, eyes narrowing as he braced for an attack. Then, almost at once, his brow unfurrowed and a knowing grin spread across his face. Behind him, 3 figures stumbled from the mist, more battered than Lafitte himself. Their uniforms hung in tatters, and Rhodes lay face first on the deck, his coat spattered with coagulated blood. "Welcome back, Captain," Lafitte called, dipping his top hat in a jaunty bow as he beamed up at Nethen. Nethan returned the smile, off his shoulders shifting from tension to relief. Robin, who'd worn a stormy frown for days, finally let her lips curve into a bright grin. In the shadowed stern, Luo leaned against the rail, offering a quiet, approving smile of his own. A ripple of laughter rose among them, lightening the damp air as it echoed through the fog. They laughed until their sides ached and the last wisps of fear dissolved. At last, Rhodes rose to his feet and The rest of the crew found their composure once more, the hush before them now charged with a renewed sense of camaraderie. Though we'd lost the ghost shadow and Shilu had fallen to Qingji's blade, the four of us still survived. We're alive and unbroken, and as long as we remain standing, the government and the Navy won't know peace. Chapter 145, The Chambord Islands, Part 5. The war room at Navy headquarters was tense. Admiral Warring States Kuzan stood behind the polished oak desk, one hand braced against its surface, his brow knotted in anger. Across from him stood Commander Nethan, his custom-tailored uniform sleeve torn, smudged with soot, and yet his posture remained calm. "You led the operation yourself," the Admiral growled. "And still they got away?" Nethan bowed his head slightly. "Admiral, we cornered the Ghost Hand pirates on the eastern shore of the Chambord Islands, but as we closed in, they managed to slip away. Ghost Hand Rhodes, Devil Sheriff Lafitte, Devil's Daughter Nico Robin, and Death Surgeon Trafalgar Law all escaped." At the mention of those names, Kuzan's eyes darkened. He strode to a side table, poured himself a cup of steaming tea, and sank into the leather sofa. After a deliberate sip, he set the cup down and fixed Nethan with a sharp stare. "Those are 4 of their most dangerous officers," Kuzan said slowly. "How could they vanish under your very nose?" Nethan moved to the coffee table and returned the gesture, pouring out a cup before seating himself opposite the Admiral. "We had the element of surprise," he explained. "We breached their camp at dawn. The majority of their crew was scattered, and we took nearly 24 prisoners. But Rhodes anticipated our tactics. He triggered a series of smoke charges and decoys that covered their retreat. By the time we cleared the haze, they were gone." Kuzan ran a hand over his face, rubbing his temples as though to banish a headache. "And the rest of their forces? Are they contained?" "For the most part," Nethan replied. "We secured the landing points and swept the beaches. Only a handful of stragglers remain at large. But losing those 4 lieutenants is a serious blow to our campaign." The Admiral let out a long, weary sigh. "Explain this to the government? It'll be an uphill battle. I authorized this entire operation under the premise that the Ghost Hand pirates were on the brink of collapse. Now they're stronger than ever, and we've given them time to regroup." Nethan stiffened, guilt flickering across his features. "I understand the stakes, Admiral. I'll propose a follow-up strike to flush them out before they can recover." Kuzan leaned forward, voice low and grave. "See that you do. The last thing we need is for these pirates to rebuild and strike again, this time with even deadlier tactics." As he rose and buttoned his coat, the Admiral's expression left no room for doubt. The next encounter would be their final chance to quell the growing threat of the Ghost Hand pirates once and for all. The world government wasted no time once the report reached them. The Ghost Hand pirates had slipped through the grasp of a Navy admiral. The 5 elders were outraged and stunned. Even accounting for the notorious fog that clings to the Devil's Triangle, no one could deny that the Ghost Hand pirates had outmatched the Navy's best. "Are we going to let a pirate crew mock us before the entire world?" Elder Duran snapped, slamming a fist against the council table. "If this goes unpunished, our authority collapses." Elder Mavros exchanged a dark look with him. "And what of Admiral Qingji? He's our strongest commander. How could he fail so spectacularly?" A tense silence fell. Admitting Qingji's failure was unthinkable, and yet they could not ignore it. If the Admiral had truly been bested by a handful of pirates, that would shatter the Navy's fearsome reputation. Elder Solon cleared her throat. "We cannot afford excuses. The Ghost Hand pirates must be hunted down relentlessly. Keep every fleet on alert around the triangle and strike the moment they reappear." The others nodded grimly. They would not let the matter drop. Every port, every shipping lane, every informant network, nothing would be spared in the manhunt for the Ghost Hand pirates. The world would see that the Marines answer to no one, pirate or otherwise. There will never be a fifth emperor of these seas. The Chambord Islands lie at the end of the first half of the Grand Line. No matter which path a ship takes, sooner or later it arrives here, where the route forks, and from this hub, vessels set sail for the New World. To a casual observer, the islands form a string of shimmering bubbles rising from the ocean like jewels. But beneath their sparkling surface lurks a darkness as deep as any abyss, a ruthless slave trade, the ever-watchful dragon people, and pirate crews more vicious than sharks. Late afternoon light glinted off the water at one quiet cove. A ramshackle pirate ship lay beached on the sand, its hull half covered in fresh tar and resin. A team of caulkers squatted at its flanks, hammering and squeezing sealant into every seam. Judging by their pace, they'd barely finished 1/10 of the job, just the beginning of what would be a months-long overhaul. 5 or 6 pirates lounged nearby, eyes half closed, owls at their sides. Some leaned against propped-up barrels, others sprawled on the sand. They traded jokes as they watched the laborers work, their laughter carried off by the warm breeze. Without warning, one of the guards stiffened. He sat up, shading his eyes with a roughened hand, staring out to sea as if his life depended on it. "Hey, what's that?" he muttered. At once, the other pirates snapped to attention and turned toward the horizon. Through the afternoon haze, they saw something dark and low riding on the waves, moving steadily closer. The murmurs died away. Even the caulkers paused, hammers in mid-swing, to squint at the distant shape. A heavy silence fell over the cove, an unspoken question hanging in the salt, thick air. What was approaching their shores? A makeshift raft, nothing more than an assortment of wooden planks crudely lashed together, floated clumsily toward the shore. A handful of bedraggled figures huddled on it, their clothes torn and hair matted with salt and sweat. A few pirates lounging on the beach shut their eyes against the glare and chuckled. "No treasure here," one snorted, "just a sorry lot." As the raft drew closer, its occupants came into sharper relief. 4 castaways sat slumped and silent, too exhausted even to beg. The pirates exchanged bored shrugs until one of them, leaning forward, suddenly froze, his brow furrowed in disbelief. "Hold on, those faces," he muttered. He glanced at his comrade, who followed his gaze to the bow of the raft. The man seated there looked pitiful, sunburned, shivering, defeated, but something about him was unmistakable. The first pirate's eyes widened. A slow grin spread across his face. "I know him," he whispered. "That's Ghost Hand Nethin?" Nethin squinted into the early morning haze as the little raft drifted closer to shore. Suddenly, one of the pirates beside him jumped to his feet, eyes widening in astonishment. That can't be," he gasped. The others turned to see what had shaken their companion so. The name Ghost Hand Rhodes hung unspoken in the salty air. A pirate so infamous his bounty topped 440 million Bailey. No one could believe the feared corsair would arrive here in such a battered vessel. "Are you sure?" another muttered, stepping forward. "Isn't he supposed to be a legend by now, either swallowed by a sea king or roasted by the Navy?" They all stared as the raft's single occupant struggled to pull himself upright, water dripping from the tattered edges of his coat. His silhouette was unmistakable, broad shoulders, that trademark hook glinting in his right hand. "Impossible, but he really does look like him," a third pirate whispered, dread warring with excitement in his voice. Suddenly, one of them, his heart pounding, snatched up a firelock from the sand and trained it on the approaching figure. "If it's truly Ghost Hand Rhodes," he panted, "just one shot, and I'll be famous across every port from here to the Grand Line." "Are you out of your mind?" his companion hissed, lurching to grab his arm. "That man's bounty is 400 million Bailey. Our captain's is barely 40. You'd have the entire Navy on your tail by sundown." The would-be marksman hesitated, finger twitching on the trigger. "Quiet," he muttered, narrowing his eyes as the raft scraped onto the shallows. "Let me get a clear shot first." Nethin felt a thrill of apprehension grip him. If it really was Ghost Hand Rhodes, then what storm had driven the notorious pirate to these deserted shoals, and how badly wounded was he? The answer would come soon enough. But whichever way the wind blew, the next moments promised to change every one of them forever. One of the pirates raised his flintlock pistol, squinting down the barrel with a wicked grin. "Even if it really is some ghostly hand," he sneered, After days drifting at sea, it'd putrefy in no time. One poke from this'll send it overboard. Hearing that, the others' jitters relaxed into eager anticipation. They edged closer to the shore, eyeing the four motionless figures huddled on the tattered raft. Starved to death, no doubt, but better safe than sorry. A few bullets would guarantee no one survived to tell the tale. Exchanging excited glances, each pirate shouldered a firearm or hefted a small cannon. Less than 10 meters out, the raft bobbed gently in the waves, ripe for the taking. Boom! Before anyone could second guess, a shot cracked across the water. Within heartbeats, the rest joined in. A thunderous barrage of musket fire and cannon blasts tore into the fragile craft, splintering wood and sending spray into the air. The pirates' triumphant laughter rang out over the roar of gunfire, certain they just made their names infamous across these waters. As the enemy gunners zeroed in on the raft carrying Nethin and 3 companions, they unleashed a blistering salvo of bullets and shells. Yet the first bullet stalled inexplicably a meter from the raft, suspended in midair. Then the second, the third, even a fist-sized shell froze on its trajectory, hanging silently as if it had struck an invisible barrier. The air grew eerily still. Not a sound pierced the tense silence. In that suspended moment, the world felt as though it had paused. Chapter 146, Killing, Part 1. The realization hit them all at once. This had to be the power of a devil fruit. No mere novice could perform such a feat. Panic flickered across the faces of the pirates crammed onto the raft. None of them were supernovas with bounties over 100 million, but they'd braved countless dangers to reach the Chambord Islands. Now, faced with this display, their courage deserted them. Hands trembling, one pirate hurled his flintlock aside and backed away. Others exchanged terrified glances, unable to tear their eyes from the silent figure at the bow. Nethin, once slumped in exhaustion, rose deliberately to his feet. His eyes, sunken and hollow from weeks at sea, held nothing but cold resolve. He raised his right hand, fingers splayed. For a heartbeat, the air in front of him quivered. Then, with a thunderous crack, it folded in on itself, like a dark wave of energy, every bullet clattering on deck, and both cannon shells, suspended by the gunner's trembling grip, stiffened as if turned to iron. In a single, horrifying instant, the projectiles shattered into shards of slag, raining down in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. Not a shot was fired. No gun exploded. Yet the pirates understood the truth in that instant. They were utterly outmatched. And Nethin, wielder of the devil fruit's fearsome gift, stood ready to deliver the final blow. Nethin's twisting force tore through the shoreline like a colossal plowshare. In an instant, the water 5 or 6 meters out bulged, and the sand and rock beneath it gave way, carving a trench of mud and collapsed tunnels along the beach. A single scream split the air. Of the 6 pirates prowling the shore, only one managed to dodge the vortex's full wrath. His 5 companions were swallowed into the churning slurry of mud, rock, and seawater, never to rise again. Nethin allowed himself a moment's respite. He had deliberately avoided flying the raft all the way to the Chambord Islands, choosing instead to give it a light push whenever he needed to advance. The effort was minimal, and his extraordinary endurance made it more than enough to carry him to his destination. He retracted his hand from the dissipating vortex, straightened, and fixed his gaze on the distant silhouette of the Chambord Islands. A faint smile curved his lips. In the blink of an eye, he vanished from the raft and reappeared on the sand before the lone surviving pirate. Ah! What is this?" The trembling man gasped, staring at the ruined bodies of his comrades. His legs gave out beneath him, and he collapsed to his knees, overwhelmed by terror. Nethin eased himself down onto his haunches and slid backward, every movement so precise that in an instant the 5 pirates lay completely out of sight, shattered beyond recognition. That was all the proof anyone needed of the power a 400 million bounty pirate wielded. Even if their captain had shown up, there'd be no stopping him. He turned his cool gaze on the lone survivor. "You've got a ship," he said quietly. "Where is it?" The pirate's face drained of blood. He trembled, tried to speak, and went pale, collapsing in a dead faint. Nethin frowned. After floating at sea for a week, his own reflection looked nothing like the carefree swordsman he'd once been. Dark circles under his eyes, hair matted with salt spray, a hard edge to his features. He admitted he was a little terrifying now. but anyone who'd spent that long adrift would understand. Behind him, Lafitte and the others finally scrambled ashore. They all stared back at their ramshackle raft, a pitiful bundle of broken planks and patched sails. It was beyond repair, utterly useless. "We need a new ship," Lafitte said, casting a hopeful look at the unconscious pirate. "Fast," Nathan nodded. "Then let's find one." Lafitte stood at the rail, his dark eyes scanning the battered pirate schooner anchored nearby. "It's about the same size as the Ghost Shadow," he said after a moment, "but the timber and rigging are far inferior. If we lose our flagship, we'll have to answer to the Roy, all Navy sooner or later." A cold chill flickered across his face. Though he'd gained rank as an admiral, he'd stowed away on Rhodes's vessel with only one purpose: to set the seas ablaze with chaos. Now, half a dozen terrified shipwrights were scrambling for the gangplank, still shaken by the crack of Nathan's shot not long ago. Nathan shifted his grip on the demon blade, his coat flapping in the salt breeze. "This is the Chambord Archipelago," he reminded them in a low voice. "We're anchored right off naval headquarters. If the authorities catch wind of our presence too quickly, an admiral will show up in force, and we'll be in real hot water." Below deck, every man and woman aboard bore the marks of 7 days at sea: hollow cheeks, stiff shoulders, and wobbling gaits. The heavy silence was broken only by the slap of waves against hull and the creak of ropes overhead. Robin finally spoke, his voice eerily calm. "We can only fault the captain for raising such a racket back there. It was completely avoidable." Nathan's jaw clenched. He turned away from the schooner's silhouette. "I've unlocked a new power," he admitted, voice barely more than a whisper, "but I'm not skilled enough to control it. We can't afford another misstep." Nathan watched as Lafitte approached the scattered craftsmen, twirling his mahogany cane with casual precision. A soft, almost imperceptible hum drifted from the polished wood, and one by one, the workers' hammers stilled. Their eyes went blank. Without a word, they set down their tools and drifted back into the forest, as if compelled by an unseen force, and with no memory of the past few days. He climbed aboard the pirate ship at a leisurely pace and called back to Lafitte. "That's enough for them. Just wipe their memories. No need for any lingering confusion." Lafitte cracked a wicked grin, then turned away, satisfied. Robin followed Nathan up the gangplank and halted under the fluttering Jolly Roger. "Blue Ghost Pirates," she said, tracing the emblem with her eyes. "Captain Blue Ghost himself. They've put a 40 million Bailey bounty on their heads." She chuckled. 40 million? He must have been feeling bold to pick a fight with our captain just now. Luo Shensheng leaned against the railing, arms folded. A year ago, a 40 million bounty would have been a serious threat. But now, I'd take on a 50 million Bailey pirate without breaking a sweat. He laughed and gave an approving clap. Nathan raised his hand, activating his distortion power. Instantly, the bubble film plating covering 1/10 of the ship peeled away, and he stepped aboard. "We'll use this vessel for now," he announced, his eyes sweeping over the deck. "There are 2 official routes into the New World, through Fishman Island on the seabed, or across the Red Clay continent with government permission. Neither applies to us. After all, I once used my gravity-twisting ability to fly the Ghost Shadow all the way to Skypea. Sending this ship over the Red Soil continent will be far easier. And should we ever need to reach Fishman Island, my awakened distortion powers can repel seawater over a large area, so we don't even need special hull coatings. But before anything else, we need rest, showers, proper recovery." He allowed a small, cold smile to touch his lips. "Just so you know, celestial dragons turn up around this island from time to time. The Navy Admiral is sworn to protect them." "Ho, ho, ho," Lafayette drawled, his grin taking on a sinister edge. "I was just wondering if the world government might invite you to join the 7 warlords, Captain." At Nathan's words, Lafayette's smile grew darker still, and Luo's lips curved into a cold, mocking smirk. They might not be able to strike the Navy Admiral outright, but that didn't mean they couldn't stir up trouble for him. After all, anyone who chose to cross them had better be ready to pay the price. Chapter 147, The Strange Pirates, Part 2. Late in the afternoon, Nathan and his crew finally allowed themselves a moment's respite aboard the battered pirate ship. They straightened their tunics and shook the salt spray from their hair, relishing the first real break in days. As dusk settled, the handful of scoundrels who had lagged ashore at various ports staggered back toward the gangplank, only to freeze in confusion when Nathan raised his hand. With a single, effortless gesture, he sent them tumbling into the dark waves below, their shouts swallowed by the sea. Even the notorious pirate captain, who'd once dangled a 40 million Bailey bounty over Nathan's head, ended up feeding the fish. By dawn, the weariness that had clung to every sailor like barnacles washed away with the tide. Spirits renewed, they set course for the Chambord Islands under a bright blue sky. Luo remained behind to keep watch over the ship, while Nathan, Rhodes, and Robin Lafitte disembarked into the bustling harbor. This archipelago marks the end of the first trade zone, Nathan said, scanning the crowd of merchants and vessels. It's one of the largest trading hubs on these seas. Our old ghost phone bugs have been compromised. Any messages we sent vanished with them. If we want to stay in touch with Kaku and the others, we'll need fresh devices. Robin nodded. Understood, Captain. Lafitte, you're free to gather intelligence. Rhodes and I will hunt down a new supplier for the bugs. Consider it done, Lafitte replied, melting into the milling market stalls. As the sun climbed higher, Nathan and his team vanished into the maze of colorful tents and whispering merchants, ready to arm themselves for the next stage of their covert mission. Lafitte offered a polite nod, tipped the brim of his hat, and was gone, melting into the flow of pedestrians. Luo and Robin mirrored his gesture, then passed beneath the great bronze arch into the heart of the Chambord archipelago. As the world's largest trading hub and the private playground of the celestial dragons, Chambord thrived on opulence. Here, heavenly gold circulated like water, buying every imaginable luxury, exotic slaves, rare devil fruits, even contraptions whose very purpose defied explanation. Towering alchemy mangrove trees loomed over the streets, their phosphorescent blossoms shedding strange, iridescent bubbles. Every corner offered a new wonder. Levitating carriages, music-toned crystals, street vendors hawking mechanical familiars. Robin let a small smile play across her lips. She was unshaken by extremes, whether the Devil's Triangle Sea or the gilded courts of the world nobles, but there was no denying the archipelago's charm. Even if shadowy deals took place behind closed doors, everything in the open gleamed with perfection. Nathan slipped his hands into the pockets of the pristine white coat he'd just purchased and shrugged. "All right," he said casually, "let's see what they're selling today." With that, the three of them set off down a bustling avenue, each drawn onward by the promise of endless curiosities. Nathan and Robin ducked into a quiet alcove below deck to install their new surveillance gear. Nathan carefully planted 4 audiobugs, tiny, nearly invisible transmitters, along the bulkheads. Then he and Robin slipped 2 compact video bugs into angled vents, making sure each camera had an unobstructed view of the room beyond. With the devices in place, Nathan tapped his wrist console and activated the secure channel. Moments later, Admiral Kaku's face appeared on the screen. "Captain," Nathan began, "the phone bugs are all replaced. Any word on what's happening in the Devil's Triangle Sea?" Kaku's brow creased. "Nothing definite. The fog is so thick now that only the world government's highest echelons and the Navy admirals know what's going on out there. Whatever it is, they're keeping it under wraps. I'll fill you in as soon as I can." "All right," Nathan said, "but have you picked up any new intelligence lately?" "There is one report from 2 days ago." Kaku replied. "A supernova nicknamed Byron the Bizarre, bounty, 230 million berries, was spotted in the Chambord Islands." "That's excellent work," Nathan said, nodding. He tapped his console to end the call and turned to Robin with a determined smile. They might not have the chance to reunite all 11 supernovas like at Sabati Archipelago, but tracking down even one of those infamous pirates was no small feat, especially one with a 230 million berry bounty. "Let's set sail for the Chambord Islands," he said. "We've got ourselves an unlucky pirate to chase." Nathan pocketed the listening bug and led Robin out of the shadowed alley. Their target was the eccentric pirate Byron, currently sporting a 230 million belly bounty. Bounties in the 200 to 300 million range usually meant at least one confirmed kill, but Byron's record was curiously clean. Capturing him, however, would still earn them 90 talent proficiency points and 1 free talent point, and more importantly, curb whatever chaotic scheme he was hatching. Attacking the celestial dragons guaranteed the world government's wrath. A newly promoted admiral would almost certainly descend on the Chambord archipelago at once. Nethin was confident he could match an admiral blow for blow, but reinforcements and intelligence never hurt. The archipelago itself was a maze of 79 mangrove islets, its winding channels notorious for shipyards that specialized in anti-corrosion hull coatings. Rumor had it Rayleigh's own vessel, the Hades, had taken 3 days and nights to slather the Thousand Sunny with its signature sunshine coat. A larger pirate ship, Byron's, would need even more time in dock. Over the next half-day, Nethin and Robin fanned out through the busy port towns. In the Salty Siren Tavern, they quizzed dock workers about any strange crews, Byron's weird pirates, as the bounty posters dubbed them. At the mangrove yards, they examined half-finished hulls for telltale signs, thick charcoal paste, fresh tar drips, and boarded-up gangplanks. By dusk, the trail led them to Dock 4, where a hulking galleon lay half-submerged in patchwork tar. Lanterns swung from its masts, casting long shadows across the wet planks. A handful of robed figures moved beneath tarps, and the air smelled of salt and burning pitch. Nethin exchanged a glance with Robin. "There's our ship," he murmured, and, he nodded at a burly man reviewing blueprints by lantern light, "there's Byron." Armed with their wits, their newly planted bug, and the promise of a hefty reward, Nethin and Robin prepared to make their move. The chase across the Chambord archipelago had finally begun. According to our intelligence, the weird pirates had sailed all the way here to the 27th island, and Nethin ran headlong into them on a crowded street. Ghost Hand, the deputy captain of the weird pirates, stood beside his leader, Captain Byron, eyes cold and unblinking as he addressed Nethin. "We blocked your path on purpose. Looking for a fight?" With a combined bounty nearing 400 million, the weird pirates were hardly the sort to turn tail at a standoff, and any supernova who'd conquered the first half of the Grand Line would be hard-pressed to claim the title Conqueror of the First Half if he cowered now. Byron himself, bounty set at 230 million, met Nethin's gaze without flinching. Yet even he knew this wasn't the place to start a brawl. They stood too close to the Navy's headquarters. The Marines could swarm them at any second. He inclined his head slightly. "I'd welcome the chance to spar, but not here. Let's take this to the New World, where we won't have to worry about Navy interference." Nethin slipped off the fresh white gloves he'd just bought, folded them neatly, and tucked them into his pocket. He stepped forward, voice cool and unwavering. "Let's wrap this up before the Navy shows up. You really want to die here?" A low, mocking chuckle came from the circle of pirates. Strange Byron, known among them as the Weirdo Pirate, snorted in response, eyes glittering with barely contained menace. He didn't want to brawl in the middle of a crowded street, but Nethin's audacity left him no choice. In an instant, the narrow avenue emptied as terrified civilians fled in every direction. Only a few brave, or perhaps contracted, onlookers pressed themselves into the shadows, watching intently. On one side stood Ghost Hand Rhodes and the Devil's Son Robin, two of the most notorious figures from the Ghost Hand pirates. On the other, almost 30 members of the weird pirates bristled with hostility. From concealed vantage points, observers whispered among themselves. "Rhodes and Robin carry bounties totaling over 500 million, one murmured. "The weird pirates are close to 400 million, and they're nearly at full strength." Normally, the Ghost Hand crew would be the clear favorites, but with only these two legends present against 30 seasoned fighters, the outcome was anyone's guess. The tension crackled in the air. Soon, steel would speak. Just a few months ago, the weird pirates, now operating under orders from the Navy headquarters fleet, had razed an island to the ground and walked away without a scratch. And in the blink of an eye, they struck again. More than a dozen rifles and cannons swiveled toward Nethin. Gunfire cracked and cannonballs roared through the air, tearing into the street around him. Before he could even take cover, the deputy captain of the weird pirates drew his long sword in one swift motion. He unleashed a wave of blade energy so fierce it ripped the pavement apart in a single gouge. At the same moment, Byron, the strangest and most unpredictable of the crew, snorted in fury. He slammed his massive fist into the cobblestones, and the very earth trembled. A pulse of unnatural force surged up from beneath Nethin's feet, shattering the ground and sending debris flying in every direction. Caught in the onslaught of steel, gunpowder, and raw power, Nethin braced himself. Every muscle in his body coiled, ready to meet the weird pirate's assault head-on. Chapter 148, Wings of Sweeping the Sky, Part 3. Nethin swept his hand in a casual backhand motion, his expression perfectly calm. Ever since the full awakening of his devil fruit power, using his ability felt as natural as breathing, fluid, precise, and infinitely more powerful than before. With a thunderous boom, the bullets and cannonballs suspended in midair cracked like crystal under his control. His twisting force condensed into a roaring vortex that tore through the street, heading straight for the weird pirates. Any sailor caught in its path was hurled aside, crushed and dismembered by the spiraling winds. Beneath Nethin's feet, the very ground buckled at the sheer intensity of his power. As he lifted his boot, the cobblestones collapsed into dust without so much as a tremor. He couldn't help but smirk at the display. This strength was beyond anything he'd imagined. The weird pirates recoiled in horror as the tornado carved a clean, horizontal slash through the buildings. Walls crumbled, timber splintered, stone shattered into rubble. It was as though a living storm had descended, determined to sweep the entire street from the map. And at its eye stood Nethin, unshaken and commanding every shred of destruction with a single thought. Byron's eyes went wide with alarm, but before he could move, the spiraling pressure slammed into him, coiling around his body like a living vice. Earthshift, Nethin bellowed, tapping into his devil fruit power. He thrust both palms forward, catching the twisting force and driving it straight into the ground. The earth exploded in a thunderous crack. Within seconds, soil and rock erupted outward as a vast sinkhole yawned open. In the space of 10 meters radius, the roots of the Alchemand mangrove were shredded, and the chasm plunged dozens of meters down until it exposed the churning sea below. Byron staggered back to the rim, shaken but unharmed. He drew his arms in from the follow-through of the push, leveling a steely glare at Nethin. "Impressive display," he said, voice low and cold, but ultimately futile. "I am a transfer master. The superhuman transfer fruit lets me absorb any power you unleash, and then turn it right back on you." "Nobody who makes it this far does so without real skill," Nethin murmured, surprise flickering across his features before he snapped back to calm. He balled his right hand into a fist and drove it toward Byron and his pirate crew. Byron let out a cold laugh. "Your power's useless against me." He planted his feet, thrust his arms forward, and activated his devil fruit ability, determined to fling Nethin's attack right back at him. The instant Byron's arms met the twisting energy, his smirk vanished. Nethin's second blow carried more than twice the force of the first. The very air around them contorted, and the street seemed to fold and crease like paper under an invisible hand. Clearly, there was an upper limit to how much energy Byron could transfer, and Nethin's punch had shattered it. "No, this can't be happening," Byron whispered, eyes wide with disbelief as he staggered under the impact. Nethin planted his feet firmly, muscles quivering and veins bulging like girders as he fought to hold back the writhing void that battered him. It was as if he were bracing against a collapsing mountain. Every ounce of his transfer power poured into resisting the onslaught. But the void, alive with malevolent intent, slithered around his arms in an instant, contorting flesh and bone. In seconds, its tendrils had snaked up his back, dragging Nethin and the trailing ranks of the weird guest pirates into its suffocating grip. Then came a thunderous crack. The twisting energy surged down the street and detonated with earth-shaking force. Buildings on both sides disintegrated, windows shattering and walls collapsing as though struck by a 10-meter-wide laser beam. Dust and debris exploded skyward, blotting out the moon. Huddled in dark doorways, terrified onlookers watched their refuge vanish in seconds. A few unlucky souls had been clipped by the fringe of the blast and tumbled into the wreckage, their screams cut short as they fought to escape the lethal pull. Cold sweat trickled down their faces. When the dust finally settled, one whisper rose above the rest. That was the Ghost Hand Rhodes." A hush fell over the ruined street as the name sank in. Ghost Hand Rhodes, the legendary pirate whose bounty now stood at 440 million berries. The bounty on the strange Byron stood at 230 million Baileys. With the hunt finally over, Nethin collected his prize, 90 talent proficiency points and 1 free talent point. He'd already burned through most of his stash, 1 point to unlock tenacity, another for spiritual heart, leaving him with only a single spare. Now, with Byron defeated, he reclaimed that extra point and stood back up to 2 in reserve. Nethin cast a last glance down the shattered street, then shook his head. Let's go. After disposing of the weird pirates, he'd realized just how deep in the Chambord Islands he'd ventured. If the Navy and government were still desperate to see him dead, it wouldn't be long before an admiral turned up on their trail. Robin gave a curt nod and fell into step behind him as they set off. But barely 10 meters away, a voice rang down from the roof of a crumbling building. Ah, too late? The weird pirates are already dead, and that 400 million Bailey reward has vanished. Looking up, they spotted a lanky figure draped in a white cloak, perched casually atop the ruin. His tone was equal parts irritation and mockery as he folded his arms and stared them down. Nethin snapped a peanut from the handful in his palm and tossed it into his mouth. He surveyed the bizarre band of pirates sprawled across the rubble, every last one of them stone-cold dead. Along the ruined street, onlookers who'd been hiding in crumbling doorways rubbed their eyes, unable to believe what they'd just witnessed. Even Rhodes and Robin came to an abrupt halt. Then, up on the highest ledge of the shattered building, a lone figure appeared. A sharp intake of breath passed from one stunned witness to the next. Could it really be? Nethin's eyes narrowed as he recognized the man draped in a white cape. "Pirate hunter fisherman, wings of the sky," he whispered. Among pirate hunters, most rely on swords or firearms. Those who master neither are nearly unheard of. On the blade side, only Dracule Hawkeye Myhawk stands above the rest. Among gunmen, fisherman is universally acknowledged as the world's top marksman. He ranks alongside the legendary one-armed Carlos, who himself fell to Myhawk's sword, making fisherman one of the strongest hunters in the seas. And according to rumor, every pirate he's ever killed fell to a single, impossibly precise peanut shot to the head. Nethin cracked another peanut between his teeth, wondering if he was about to see that deadly talent in action. Although he's celebrated as the world's premier gunman, almost no one has ever seen his weapon. A hushed gasp rippled through the shadowed onlookers when Nethin pronounced the name of the man in the white cloak. And for anyone still skeptical, the rankings left no room for doubt. Carlos stood immediately behind the enigmatic fisherman. Chapter 149, Swift Fruit, Part 4. Atop the crumbling rooftop, fisherman casually cracked peanuts between his fingers and glared down at Nethin. "You just blew 400 million berries in one go," he sneered. Nethin, known among the pirate hunters as Ghost Hand and carrying a 440 million berry bounty, sized him up. He'd never heard of fishermen before, but the man's cool confidence told its own story. Nethin shrugged. 400 million is pocket change to someone like you. You hunters must be bored out of your skulls. Fisherman tilted his head, a slow smile spreading across his face. "True enough. This work is dull. I've been thinking, why not aim higher? Maybe conquer the world. What do you say? Join my crew?" A faint grin curved Nethin's lips. He had been looking for a gunman of real caliber. Fisherman's eyes flickered with surprise. "You know my name?" he asked. "I'm Fisherman, one of the pirate hunters' elite. But world domination? Have you lost your mind?" He plucked a single peanut from his pile, weighed it between thumb and forefinger, then flicked it toward Nethin. To any bystander, it would have seemed like a trivial missile. Instead, the peanut tore through the air, shattering the sound barrier in an instant, its velocity more than doubled by Fisherman's uncanny precision. Nethin barely had time to raise an eyebrow before the tiny projectile slammed into the wall behind him, splintering stone and echoing across the night sky. Nethin's eyes narrowed as he absorbed the lesson in that single instant. Speed is power. At such velocities, even an ordinary peanut can become a deadly projectile. The moment his devil fruit awakening activated, Nethin felt the distortion ability flicker to life in his mind. A stray peanut hurtled toward him, its trajectory carrying it into the 3-foot sphere of his hockey. It accelerated in a blur, then, just as suddenly, slowed to a crawl. Inch by inch, it pressed forward until it shattered into fine powder against an invisible barrier. Fisherman's jaw dropped. He raked a hand through his hair in astonishment. "I really did underestimate you," he said, voice grudging but amused. "Even with that power, you won't be conquering the seas anytime soon. Still, mark my words, your bounty's headed well above 440 million. He popped another peanut between his teeth and in the next heartbeat, vanished. Robin watched the spot where Fisherman had stood, her brow furrowed. "That was incredible speed?" Nethan finished for her. He gave a slow nod. "Yes, but that wasn't his own movement speed. It's the devil fruit at work." Robin's eyes lit up with realization. He can accelerate objects like those peanuts to superhuman velocities in an instant. Nethan tapped his chin thoughtfully. "If my guess is right, it must be a superhuman-type devil fruit in the time manipulation branch. That would explain the sudden bursts of speed and the way he can control acceleration on the fly." Robin exchanged a glance with Nethan. A time-based fruit. No wonder he disappeared so easily. Nethan allowed himself a small, determined smile. "Now we know what we're up against." Nethan closed his eyes and ran through his memories. There was the slow fruit, the regressive fruit, so this speed fruit had to be its counterpart. One slows you down, the other hurls you forward. And that peanut attack just now had radiated an outrageously domineering armament color, its piercing power almost unrivaled. Even if he couldn't yet match a Navy admiral blow for blow, he was at least in the same league. Without a direct confrontation, there was no way to know who would win. He assessed Fisherman's strength with cool calculation. He'd been caught off guard, unable to raise his arm in time to block the peanut's lightning speed. But ever since awakening the twisting fruit's power, a single thought could unleash a spiraling force through his entire body, forming a twisting barrier around him. As long as that barrier held, no strike could seriously wound him. And if an attack did manage to cut through, it would be decelerated on impact, just as the peanut bolt had been, giving him an instant to evade. This same trick had allowed him to slip away from Qingji's relentless pursuit. Otherwise, he'd have been caught long ago. "I'm still a bit too slow," he admitted to himself. With a quiet breath, Nethan summoned the talent system interface into view. Now that the twisted fruit had fully awakened, its power surged, and crucially, Nethan could project that twisting energy outside his body, easing the internal strain. His fruit ability and his physical enhancements were again in perfect balance, so he no longer needed to shore up his stamina. After a moment's thought, Nethan invested 40 proficiency points into agility enhancement. Agility enhancement, 260, master level. Physical enhancement, 400, master level. Spirituality enhancement, 0, basic. Toughness enhancement, 50, intermediate. That 40-point boost closed much of the speed gap between him and Qingji. He still wasn't quite as fast as she was, but he'd eliminated any overwhelming disadvantage in a head-on clash. 50 points remained unspent. With the Twisted Fruit's skill tree now at 510 points and perfectly matched to his physique, any further allocation had to go into either the fruit's powers or his physical enhancement, and in either case, the benefit would be marginal. Nethan paused, weighing his next move. Nethan studied the battle system's talent interface. He had 50 proficiency points to invest, and he knew that whether he poured them into scholarly arrogance, armament mastery, or endurance and spirit, any of those choices could shatter his current limits and push him up to intermediate rank. An even more extreme option would be to trigger an advanced enhancement for a massive single attribute boost. Then an idea struck him. A decisive smile crossed his face as he tapped to allocate all 50 points to domineering. A soft hum filled the air. Golden light pulsed through the interface as icons and numbers realigned, finally settling on the updated stat sheet. Gunfire, 50. Melee combat, 100. Twisted Fruit Mastery, 510. Navy 6/0. Navy 6 Paper Technique, 0. Six-fold Moonstep, 0. Domineering, 100. Armored Domineering, 50. When the display blinked out, Nethan felt the change instantly. His aura of sheer willpower expanded, his perceptual field ballooned, and every nuance in his surroundings snapped into razor-sharp focus. He replayed his last sparring session against Qingji. Even with Spirit Mind activated, He'd barely kept up with her full-speed assault. Now, every muscle twitch, every breath, would stand out in vivid detail, a promise of total dominance in the battles to come. Nethin perched on a rocky outcrop overlooking the turquoise waters of the Chambord archipelago, his enhanced senses humming with activity. Thanks to the Devil Fruit's recent upgrades, 50 points to vision and hearing, 40 to agility, he could track even the swift-footed Qingji tribesmen darting through the jungle below. Spotting a wandering kiwi in the underbrush was no stretch. Creatures of all kinds prowled these isles. With his sharpened reflexes, he needn't rely on distortion powers to keep pace. He tapped his earpiece. "Robin, send Lafitte back to the ship. Our position's been compromised. The Navy's admiral could show up any moment." A tense pause. Then Robin's calm voice crackled through. "Understood. We'll fall back." Nethin studied the horizon. If Admiral Kizaru arrived, he wouldn't be cowed. But protecting Lafitte, Robin, and the others? That was another matter. Their strength still lagged behind a marine flotilla. Nethin, on the other hand, was itching for a showdown. He wouldn't mind drawing Kizaru into a 2-on-1, or better yet, sniping a few marines along the way. Let the world government and the Navy gossip about him all they liked. He was done being their puppet. Nethin slid from the rocks and sprinted toward the rendezvous point, every muscle coiled and ready. Meanwhile, at Navy headquarters in Marinef, Ord, Admiral Kizaru stood before the giant holomap table, its surface pulsing with the real-time positions of marine vessels in the East Blue. His golden-hued light fingers tapped thoughtfully against his chin. "Chambord Archipelago," he murmured. Nethin, has made his move." Behind him, Vice Admiral Onagumo and Fleet Admiral Sakazuki exchanged grim looks. The game was on, and this time, the hunter had become the hunted. On the top floor of Marine headquarters, Fleet Admiral Sengoku stood in the center of his office, brows knitted as he listened to his subordinate's urgent report. At that moment, Admiral Kizaru swept in, his justice cloak billowing behind him. Sengoku glanced up and inclined his head in greeting. "Ghost Hand Rhodes has surfaced in the Chambord archipelago," the subordinate announced. "He slew Byron, the supernova known as Byron the Brave, and continues to hunt down pirates designated as vicious criminals." Kizaru moved to the low coffee table, poured himself a cup of tea, and took a deliberate sip before setting the cup down. His voice was calm but heavy with concern. "I understand that these criminals deserve the death sentence," he said. "Yet executing them without a proper trial would undermine the very justice the world government stands for." Sengoku's face darkened, but Kizaru's words rang true. Even if their targets were pirates guilty of heinous crimes, summary executions would be seen as contempt for the law. Kizaru resumed speaking. "Rhodes's return to the Chambord Islands cannot be ignored. If we do nothing, the government will accuse us of negligence, or worse, complicity. I'm departing immediately to apprehend him." He finished his tea in a single, measured swallow, set the cup on its saucer, and rose. With a curt nod to Sengoku, Kizaru strode out of the office, already heading toward his ship. Sengoku watched him go, the weight of the new threat pressing down on him like never before. If he planned to challenge one of the four emperors, he'd need the endurance to stretch the battle out. But when it comes to anyone less formidable, it's just another side trip. Subduing them might earn him credit, and failing costs him nothing. Besides, even if Nethin and his companions escaped Admiral Aokiji's grasp, there's no way they could outpace him. In sheer speed, he leaves Aokiji in the dust. Chapter 150, Snatching, Part 5, Island 47. A dozen men moved silently along the roadside, their presence barely noticeable. Passers-by might catch a glimpse of them before quickly averting their eyes, uneasy under their silent scrutiny. Each man bore the same insignia on his shoulder or back, a circular, grinning face logo marking them as part of the Don Quixote family, Doflamingo's feared crew, and one of the 7 warlords under the king. After a short distance, the group slipped into a shadowed alcove where a lone figure dressed entirely in black waited. Gradius, the family's bomber specialist, stepped forward and fixed the stranger with a steady glare. "Did you bring it?" Gradius demanded in a low, controlled voice. The man in black spread his hands in mock innocence. "Would the boss trust me to carry anything less than the best?" he replied smoothly. "I'm only here to make the connection and then lead you to the rendezvous point." Gradius snorted, You sure are cautious." The man offered a thin smile. "We may be small fry compared to the great Don Quixote family, but a little caution never hurt anyone. Now, do you have the money?" Nathan fixed a cold stare on the man in black. With a subtle gesture, he signaled his Don Quixote enforcers to step forward. They opened the battered case at their feet, and inside lay nothing but stacks of Bailey banknotes. The man in black's gaze flicked greedily over the money. He swallowed. "You promised me 500 million in arms plus 400 million in Bailey, yet here I see only the cash." Nathan's face remained impassive. "We never intended to complete the arms transfer in an alley. Let us to the real exchange. No tricks." A crooked smile curved the man in black's lips. "Our boss has everything prepared." He turned on his heel and strode into the night, with Nathan and his men close behind. Together, they slipped from the alley toward a deserted seaside pier. No sooner had they gone than a lone figure emerged from the shadows. In the dim streetlight, he drew back his hood to reveal a thin, calculating smile. "Ho, ho, ho," he murmured, eyes glinting. "The Don Quixote family, such formidable foes. I wonder what colossal deal awaits them." With that, he melted into the darkness once more. Just as Lafitte was about to give chase, the Den Den Mushi in his pocket buzzed. He lifted the little shell to his ear, and Nico Robin's calm voice crackled through. "Return to the ship for a meeting," she ordered. "I copy," he replied, "but I've stumbled onto something potentially valuable. The Don Quixote family's big operation here could turn out differently than anyone expects." Robin paused for a moment, then relayed Crocodile's answer. "You're free to move as you like. Just be careful." A sly smile curved at the corner of Lafitte's mouth. He slipped the Den Den Mushi away, melted into the shadows, and silently resumed his pursuit of Gladius and the others. They pressed farther out, edging toward the island's fringe, completely unaware of their tail. Lafitte's mastery of stealth and tracking left them no clue he was there. At last, the Don Quixote party emerged onto a deserted beach in the Chambord archipelago. A lone, medium-sized ship lay anchored in the shallow surf. Lafitte pressed the Den Den Mushi against his ear one more time. "Boss," he whispered, "the Don Quixote family has arrived." Nathan strode up to the side of the small vessel and raised his voice. "Hold it there." Footsteps echoed on deck. Then a burly man in a captain's hat, his brown beard flecked with salt, emerged alongside 20 burly sailors. He carried a single wooden crate under one arm. Nathan's dark eyes locked onto the box. He gave a curt nod to his own crew. "Open it." With a grunt, one of Nathan's men pried off the lid. Inside lay row upon row of stacked treasure, perfectly bundled stacks of berries, 400 million in all. The captain's eyes glittered with greed, and a slow smile spread across his face. He set down his crate, reached for the latch, and lifted the lid. Nestled in straw was a devil fruit, its skin an odd khaki yellow, as if coated in fine sand. Unlike the familiar animal or humanoid varieties, this fruit crackled with a dusty aura. Nature itself seemed to ripple across its surface. Word had spread that nearly 2 years had passed since the sand crocodile's demise, and that the coveted sand fruit had vanished from the seas. Now, here it was again, in the hands of the notorious Don Quixote family, and right where Nathan stood, ready to claim his prize. After Ace's death, the burning fruit was finally within reach, and with it, the nature system naturally unveiled the rustling fruit as its counterpart. Gladius stared at the delicate devil fruit resting in the wooden box, his eyes glinting with greed. Though he had already consumed the superhuman-type explosion fruit, he treated this 900 million belli, nature-type rustling fruit with the utmost reverence. If the Don Quixote family acquired it, they could train another high-ranking officer, perhaps even a top commander, and extend their grip over the seas. Suppressing his excitement, Gladius inhaled deeply and gave his men the signal to lay out the payment. At the same time, he reached for the fruit. Whether he intended to uphold the deal, betray his seller and snatch back Bailey, or seize the rustling fruit by force first, it made no difference. This prize was his priority. Just as his fingers brushed the smooth surface of the devil fruit, a small, thumb-sized cylinder hurtled through the air from a distance and clattered onto the wooden floor. Boom! The unexpected intrusion froze everyone in place. Before the wooden box even hit the ground, it split open with a sharp crack. Instantly billowing a silvery mist, that swallowed the clearing for nearly 10 meters in every direction. Captain Brownbeard staggered back, clutching the box to his chest. Across the swirl of fog, Gradius, sent by the Don Quixote family, stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the prize. Just as his fingers grazed the box's edge, a polished mahogany cane shot through the haze. With a decisive smack, it knocked the box from Brownbeard's grasp and jutted sharply against the back of Gradius's hand. Gradius recoiled, pain flaring across his knuckles. His glare burned through the mist. "Who?" he roared. "No one interferes with Don Quixote interests." In a heartbeat, he flicked his wrist and unleashed a cluster of explosive orbs into the fog-shrouded space. Boom, boom, boom. The violent detonations ripped apart the lingering smoke and sent guards scrambling amid cries of the wounded. But Gradius's chest heaved with determination. He would not let the coveted rust fruit slip through his fingers. Nethan unleashed a volley of explosive blasts at the shadowy figure who dared to snatch the legendary devil fruit. As the smoke billowed around him, he twisted through the haze, vaulting into the air, just as the thief hoisted a battered wooden box. With a swift motion, Nethan thrust out his hand and seized the prize. He landed lightly on the stone courtyard, expression cool and controlled. "You dare interfere with the Don Quixote family's business?" he murmured, nostrils flaring as he glanced back at the spot he'd bombarded. The fog was already lifting, but there was no sign of the thief, only a scattering of pale cherry blossom petals drifting across the ground. They mocked him with their silent beauty. Nethan's dark eyes sharpened. He shifted his grip on the box, then eased off the ornate brass latch. The moment the lid creaked open, his jaw tightened. Inside lay nothing but 3 delicate pink petals, exactly mirroring those scattered at his feet. The devil fruit was gone, vanished without a trace. "Damn it," he hissed, slamming his palm against the empty wood. "Who are you? Show yourself." The petals fluttered in the breeze, as if laughing at his fury. And somewhere in the fading mist, the real thief watched, smiling. Gradius's face went pale, and his jaw clenched in rage. He was seconds away from unleashing his devil fruit power to obliterate this place, but no matter how thoroughly he searched, there was no sign of his quarry. The only things that lingered in his mind were the rich mahogany cane and the fleeting silhouette that had melted into the fog. Chapter 151, Darkness, Part 1. The gentle sea breeze carried the salt tang of the ocean as Nethan stepped onto the docks of the Chambord archipelago. For now, he was unaware of Lafayette's true allegiance, though it was only a matter of time before he crossed paths with the Don Quixote family. Staying one step ahead was essential, especially since Lafayette had hinted at a clandestine transaction of priceless artifacts, perhaps even a legendary supreme knife. Nethan's instincts told him there was more at stake here than mere coin. Ever since awakening his devil fruit power, Nethan no longer needed to rely on sheer force of his fists to unleash the distortion energy coursing through him. With a thought, he could channel that rippling power into any weapon, swords, knives, spears, hurling them with a shockwave akin to Whitebeard's Quake ability. Securing a supreme sword would be perfectly fitting for someone of his reputation and ambitions. After dispatching Robin and Lafitte back to the Thousand Sunny to keep watch from the sea, Nethan set out to locate a single name that pulsed at the edge of his memory. Silvers Rayleigh, former first mate of the Roger Pirates, and legend whispered throughout the New World as the Dark King. Rayleigh's bounty had once climbed to an astonishing 2 billion berries, and though Nethan knew that approaching him could invite nothing but abuse, or worse, he was desperate for any scrap of information. He found the Dark King in a shadowy tavern tucked between rusted warehouses, his silvery hair and weathered features almost unrecognizable under a battered straw hat. Nethan offered a flask of rare grain wine in exchange for a moment of conversation. At first, Rayleigh merely chuckled and downed the wine, as if amused by the young man's audacity. But as the liquor warmed his veins, the old pirate loosened his tongue and let drop a string of half-cryptic clues. A reference to Don Quixote ships gathering off the northern reefs, a whispered name, Dr. Vegapunk, and a fleeting hint about an artifact so powerful it could reshape the very seas. Nethan listened intently, filing away every word. Some of the Dark King's revelations confirmed what he already recalled from his fragmented memories, yet far more remained outside his knowledge. As Rayleigh rose to leave, muttering about debts he must settle, Nethin felt the first true stirrings of a storm on the horizon, one that threatened to plunge the dangerous waters ahead into complete darkness. Nethin had learned a great deal from Rayleigh, far more than he'd gleaned on his own, and much of it promised to be invaluable. Yet after hopping from the 4th island to the 5th in the Chambord chain, he still hadn't uncovered so much as a whisper of Pluto, Rayleigh's whereabouts. Glancing at the sinking sun, he realized the Navy wouldn't be far behind. An admiral was sure to show up here any minute. He didn't relish the thought of tangling with a Marine admiral on neutral ground. Not only was defeating one beyond his current strength, but even if he managed to win, what would it prove? Besides, the Navy's headquarters lay just beyond the last islet. Reinforcements would pour in the moment trouble started. Better to slip away now, regroup, and come back stronger. So he wheeled around, set his course, and began retracing his steps. That's when the silence hit him. Absolute, surreal. Nethin froze. A few hundred yards down the deserted road, every passerby had come to a halt. Like fallen dominoes, one by one, they bowed their heads, dropped to their knees, and pressed their foreheads against the cobblestones. Not a whisper or rustle escaped their protest. Heart-pounding, Nethin crept closer, just in time to see the reason why. At the head of the silent procession, riding atop a slave forced to crawl on all fours, was a man wearing what looked like a transparent bubble helmet. His gilded jacket gleamed in the fading light, and as he surveyed the street, even the stone buildings seemed to bow before him. World nobles, a Tenryubito. In that instant, Nethin knew the Re was no choice but to stay hidden and pray he could slip away before they noticed him. For 800 years, the descendants of the kings who founded the world government have lived above the law. No statute binds them, and any slight against their person is treated as a capital offense, punishable on the spot. This morning, Sharmak lounged atop a laborer's back as though it were a royal palanquin. He yawned, bored, his retinue trailing respectfully behind. None dared address him without permission. As they made their way down a silent street, his gaze drifted to the crowd of supplicants kneeling along the road. His eyes landed on a young woman to his left, her posture trembling, her face pale. He cocked his head, studied her, and nodded in approval. "That one," he said. "She'll do nicely." One of his attendants bowed and hurried off. "Yes, Your Grace. We will prepare the formalities at Mary Joa's holy sanctuary. Our 21st Lady awaits her welcome." Sharmak's other guards strode forward, their expressions flat. The girl's eyes widened in terror, but before she could plead, they seized her roughly by the arms. Cries of panic broke the street's hush, but no one dared intervene. The onlookers remained prostrate, beads of sweat glinting on their foreheads, powerless as Sharmak's new prize was hauled away. Nethin had heard the warnings 1,000 times before. Offend the Tianlong clan, and you might as well write your own death warrant. Any deliberate attack on a Tianlong citizen summons not mercy, but the Admiral's wrath. Here in the Chambord archipelago, their private stronghold, even the fiercest pirates and the so-called supernovas of the first half of the Grand Route dare only bow their heads and turn away. Today's parade of fear was no different. From the shoreline to the narrow market lanes, every soul froze when the Admiral's guardian appeared. He moved through the crowd with cold efficiency. None dared speak or move to halt him. Then, without hesitation, he stepped forward and seized the young woman at his side. She was trembling, her eyes pleading for help, but around her, faces remained impassive, sealed by dread. Nethin watched helplessly as the guardian led her away. Recognition flared in his chest. He'd known her once, before the Tianlong power made this impossible. Anger and grief warred within him, but the icy shadow of the Admiral's authority held him fast. No one stirred, no one spoke, and so the procession vanished into the harbor's mist, leaving the crowd to absorb its silent warning. No act of defiance against the Tianlong would go unpunished. The sky was an immaculate blue, but for the people below it might as well have been black. The combined authority of the celestial dragons, the world government, and the Navy's admiral pressed down like a mountain of clouds, smothering every breath. In the deadly hush, one of the celestial dragons, seated arrogantly atop his slave, snapped his head up, fury flashing in his eyes. "Hey, you there," he roared. "Don't you know you're supposed to kneel? How dare you stand before me?" All along the street, the citizenry knelt in terrified unison, all except one. At the center of that prostrate sea stood a lone figure, shoulders squared, gaze unwavering. To defy a celestial dragon so brazenly was unheard of and utterly inconceivable to the onlookers. At the dragon's shout, every head lifted. Bewildered, they stared at the man who dared to remain upright. Unfazed, he returned the dragon's furious glare. Softly, deliberately, he asked, "Why bow before garbage?" Silence fell like a shroud. Nethin's words rang out in the stillness, and a wave of shock rippled through the kneeling crowd. Who was this man, whose simple question carried more power than any sword? Nethin's words hung in the air like a challenge. Every head turned toward him, jaws dropping. Lord Charmak froze. Never before had anyone dared to speak so insolently in his presence. The moment settled over the courtyard like a heavy fog, and then Charmak's face twisted in fury. A vein throbbed at his temple. His lips peeled back from clenched teeth as the full force of his anger seized him. "You insolent wretch!" Charmak snarled, his voice booming across the kneeling rows of attendants. Beside him, his guards exchanged uneasy glances. One of them finally found his voice and barked at Nethin. "Do you even understand what you've said? How dare you insult Saint Charmak? Beg for his mercy, you filthy untouchable." At the guard's command, several heavily armored men charged forward. But before a single boot had cleared the courtyard's threshold, a rippling wave of pressure burst from Nethin. It swept across the stones like a tidal surge, cracking the ground, flattening the first ranks of guards, and hurling them into each other in unspeakable ruin. In the heart of the courtyard, the earth split open, yawning into a jagged pit several meters deep. Silence followed, broken only by the distant echoes of stone collapsing and the soft cries of the wounded. Onlookers, everyone who had knelt in the long avenues flanking the courtyard, rose, trembling. Their eyes were wide with the same thought. He's no ordinary rebel. He's a pirate. And in that moment, they understood. Nethin's power was far beyond anything they had ever faced. Ghost Hand Rhodes, captain of the Ghost Hand Pirates, fixed him with a hard stare. A few onlookers murmured in sudden recognition. Nethin! No one had expected a pirate to rise up so defiantly. In truth, Nethin had never shown the slightest sign of submission. He hadn't knelt once. Hadn't he feared the admirals? Offending the celestial dragons always invited the Navy's wrath. As the initial shock gave way to dread, the crowd's faces darkened. Time and again, pirates who dared challenge the dragons found themselves crushed without mercy by the admirals. If the dragons' privileges had long been a source of suffering, then the admirals hovered above them like an unbreakable storm cloud, a suffocating shroud of despair that would never lift. Chapter 152, The Late Yellow Ape, Part 2. Charmak stared, disbelief and fury warring in his eyes. You damned pariah, how dare you?" he stammered, finally finding his voice after witnessing the impossible. In one fluid motion, Nethin had sent every one of Charmak's guards flying, then vanished as completely as a ghost. Rage flared in Charmak's chest, but beneath it a flicker of fear. This was no ordinary criminal. This was the madman bold enough to take on the Navy's best. Behind him, the attendant's face went pale. Cold sweat beaded on his forehead as he swallowed hard. "Sir, he's not just any pirate," he managed. "That was Ghost Hand Nethin, captain of the Ghost Hand Pirates. His bounty, it's 440 million berries. There's no way we can handle him alone." Charmak's lips curled into a savage grin. "Is that so?" he snarled. "Then summon the admiral. Let's see how this so-called pirate trash fares against the Navy's finest." The attendant fumbled for his communicator, thumb poised over the emergency channel. But before he could call for backup, a strange pulsating force rippled down the street. Every head turned as an eerie hush fell over the plaza, and all eyes locked on the source of that unsettling power. Nethin's controlled burst of power tore down the center of the street like a silent blade. It swept past the crowds gathered on either side without so much as a hair being ruffled, then curled around the Tianlong warriors and his own men in a perfect unbreakable circle. Anyone who had heard of the legendary Admiral technique might have recognized it in an instant, but Nethin showed no hint of pride or surprise. He fixed both the Tianlong soldiers and his stunned lieutenants with a cold, immovable stare. With a single, decisive flick of his outstretched hand, every servant and guard who tried to stand in the way was sent sprawling to the hard cobblestones. Bodies hit the earth with sickening thuds, and the street fell eerily silent. From atop the massive slave beast, Charmark's face finally drained of color. The creature reared and bucked, hurling him to the ground. Panic clutched at Charmark's throat as he scrambled upright, eyes darting to the ornate chain coiled around the beast's neck. Fingers trembling, he yanked at it, desperate to pull the explosive ring free. "Quick, someone, stop him," he cried, voice cracking. But the slave beast refused to obey. Instead, it turned its enormous head toward Nethin, lips curling into what looked like a relieved grin. In its calm, unflinching gaze, Charmark saw the truth. This man could not be moved or intimidated. He felt it in his bones. Nethin was something far stronger than any of them had ever faced. Damned if he didn't know it now. Nethin watched impassively as Charmark kicked the slave. But the man didn't cower. His head whipped around, bloodshot eyes locking onto his tormentor. A tremor ran through Nethin's spine. Then, with a deafening crack, the explosive collar at the slave's throat detonated. Flesh and blood spattered the deck. Cold as obsidian, Nethin's gaze flicked over the ruined body and settled on Charmark. In the next heartbeat, he was already upon him. You pariah. What do you think you're—" Charmark choked out, panic shredding his composed mask. His eyes bulged. Death was a stranger to him. As a noble of Tianlong, he'd always stood above consequence. The idea that anyone would dare kill him was unthinkable. Was this lunatic insane? Nethin's expression remained stone still. He raised his foot. Suddenly, the sky split open in a blinding golden radiance, like a second sun. Within that brilliance, a figure hurtled toward them at impossible speed. But it was already too late. Nethin's boot came down. When the golden beam struck, Nethin's feet touched down hard. In an instant, raw power ripped through the earth beneath him. Charmark's body, and the ground more than 10 meters below, shattered in a thunderous explosion. The debris tore through the tangled roots of the Alchemine mangrove, then plunged into the sea, leaving nothing but a yawning crater. Kisaragi arrived on the scene just as the echo of destruction died away. His pale face twisted in disbelief. Nethin had actually killed a celestial dragon. He'd never imagined such a thing could happen. Even to offend one carried the weight of a capital crime. A Navy admiral would be dispatched immediately to contain the fallout. And here, in the Chambord Islands, they were not merely insulted, but faced the outright slaying of a celestial dragon. A heavy silence fell over the plaza. The 5 elders of the government, as well as every soldier and civilian kneeling along the boulevard, stared at the smoldering hole where Charmark had vanished. None could believe that a single man, Nethin, had unleashed such power against one of the most sacred figures in the realm. Unlike Kizaru's own grim temper, what had just happened struck everyone like a faint shaft of light tearing through the oppressive cloud that had blanketed the world. Celestial dragons weren't gods. Celestial dragons could die too. A heavy silence fell. Then Kizaru spoke, his tone slow and deliberate. As a Navy admiral, he'd weathered countless battles and crises. He recovered quickly from the shock surging inside him. Yet his usually weathered features carried an uncommon solemnity. This situation was that dire. He fixed his gaze on Nethin, narrowing his eyes. "Ghost Hand Nethin, do you understand what you've done?" he asked quietly. "I suspected you might be dangerous, but now it's clear." He trailed off, unwilling to voice the thought that echoed in everyone's mind. This young man was as perilous as Dragon, the Revolutionary Army's leader, a far greater threat than any world noble. Nethin turned his head slowly to look at the admiral. He wasn't the least bit surprised by Kizaru's arrival. Navy headquarters lay just beyond the bay, and if any Marine could close the distance in an instant, it was the so-called light human himself. Days ago, Qingji had tailed Nethin through the Devil's Triangle Sea for several days, but in the end, he'd shaken her off. The region's impenetrable fog certainly helped, but the bottom line was unambiguous. She failed to catch him. An unexpected turn, to be sure. Nethin fixed Admiral Kizaru with a cold stare. "You were one step too late," he said. "Honestly, I came here hoping for a bit of peace, not a headache." Kizaru's usual laid-back smile wavered for a moment, revealing a flicker of genuine irritation. It hadn't mattered to him whether he captured Nethin. He'd been more curious than anything. But everything changed once Rhodes murdered a celestial dragon right here on the Chambord Islands. With that atrocity on his record, Kizaru, still lingering on the island, could offer no excuse if he failed to arrest Nethan now. What had started as an optional pursuit had become a mandatory mission. Rhodes had to be stopped, and Nathan was his only lead. A ripple of voices broke out behind them. "Admiral Kizaru!" Islanders crowded in, recognizing one of the Navy's 3 legendary commanders. From their eager expressions, it was clear they'd caught wind of Kizaru's urgency, and none of them doubted that this tense standoff would have far-reaching consequences. A hush fell over the crowd as a trembling voice announced the intruder's identity and codename, Kizaru. No one dared cross the celestial dragons, not even the most hardened pirates, because to offend one of the heavenly kings was to invite the full fury of the marine admirals. Stripped of an admiral's protection, a dragon would be torn apart by vengeful mobs before they could blink. Who could possibly survive that? And yet here stood Ghost Hand Rhodes, defying the world government itself, its sacred heaven no less, and having just slain a celestial dragon in cold blood. Grief, rage, and hatred rippled through every spectator. The act was unthinkable. Still, whether Rhodes was pirate or revolutionary, he had become a single, brilliant ray of hope piercing the world's darkest clouds. Now that light faced its gravest crisis. The looming shadow of an admira, the very black cloud in the sky, had fallen over Rhodes and all who dared stand with him. Chapter 153, Beating the Yellow Monkey, Part 3. The last of the Tianlong clan lay motionless on the deck. With their deaths, there was no longer any reason to remain kneeling before the Admiral of Justice. Slowly, the Marines on deck rose to their feet, glancing at one another before retreating to give the fallen space. In the meantime, scores of naval officers moved in to cordon off the area. This was the Admiral's responsibility, after all. As they pulled back, a few low-ranking Marines couldn't help but murmur to each other about Admiral Kizaru. Whispers slithered through the ranks. "He's nothing but a lackey for the Tianlong clan," one hissed. "This so-called justice is just his excuse to protect them," another added. Their voices were barely audible, yet deliberate. Unknown to them, Admiral Kizaru's sharp ears caught every slur. His expression darkened, lips curling into a cold snarl. He turned his icy gaze on Nethan, the young warrior who had single-handedly torn through the Tianlong fighters and now stood poised to leave. In an instant, Kizaru moved with breathtaking speed, closing the distance between them in a heartbeat. His boot connected with Nethan's side in a bone-jarring kick, sending him skidding across the deck. Splinters flew as Nethan hit the wooden planks hard, rolling to absorb the impact. Kizaru loomed over him, fury blazing in his eyes. "You'll pay for daring to defy me, and for insulting the honor of the Tianlong clan," he spat. The surrounding Marines fell silent, awaiting their admiral's next orders as Nethan struggled to rise. Nethan tensed as Kizaru closed in, his golden aura flickering with impatience. I'd been half ready to quip that Nethan had just been struck by the speed of light, but Kizaru wasn't in the mood for jokes. His sole intent now was to subdue the boy and haul him off to trial. With a low hum, Kizaru's foot shot forward. At 2 feet out, Nethan instinctively raised an arm to brace himself, his movements slow, almost pleading. Yet as that radiant kick sliced into his guard, it abruptly decelerated and burst into a dazzling shaft of gold light. To Kizaru's amazement, Nethan's twisted barrier held firm, catching the blow squarely on his forearm. Boom! The force still hurled Nethan backward, sending him crashing through 2 buildings before he finally skidded to a stop in an open courtyard. Dust and splintered debris settled around him, but Nethan himself rose unscathed, his barrier intact. Kizaru narrowed his eyes. The speed of light, he thought, wasn't enough to fell this kid in one shot. Dismissive or not, he'd have to land more than a single kick to claim victory over Nethan. As the fruit's power surged to life within him, the gap between Nethan and General Kizaru remained, though it had shrunk from an impassable moat to a mere distance. From beyond that space came Kizaru's taunt. "Mind taking it easy?" In the next instant, the general materialized at Nethan's back and drove a sharp kick into him while shouting, "Let me explain this to the Tianlongs." Boom! Nethan's icy stare tracked every flicker of Kizaru's movement. The first attack had caught him off guard. but now he spun just in time to block the general's follow-through. After 2 quick exchanges, Nethan made a critical realization. Kizaru was indeed faster than Shinji, but he was nowhere near the speed of light. Exactly as Nethan had suspected, Kizaru's reflexes hit the upper boundary of human consciousness, not the fruit's theoretical maximum. The devil fruit might allow its user to move at light speed, but no human mind can formulate an intention that fast. First must come the thought to strike, then the body can obey. And in that interval, Nethan saw his opening. No mortal mind can truly operate at the speed of light. Every impulse, every motion, is bound by the limits of human reaction time. That, too, is the ceiling on Kizaru's velocity. Twisted impact! Already thrown back once by Kizaru's kick, Nethan summoned his twisted gravity technique. In an instant, his body inverted, tracing a perfect parabola through the air as he lashed out with a punch. On the rugged ground below, Kizaru planted his feet and lashed out with a slender, blindingly fast kick that met Nethan mid-air. A surge of golden light crackled outward, slicing through the young man's invisible gravity field. The energy slammed into Nethan with a thunderous crack, throwing him off balance. But Nethan refused to yield. He caught the shockwave of the explosion between cupped hands, twisted it violently, and compressed its raw power into a tightly coiled sphere. With a sudden pivot, he hurled the gathered force into the empty sky behind him. Before that counterstrike could mature, Kizaru flickered into existence on Nethan's back, landing a devastating kick that echoed through the clearing. Boom! An ear-splitting roar split the sky, and a blinding burst of golden light washed over the island, illuminating every street and alley. Crowds of terrified onlookers spilled into the open, their faces upturned in shock and awe. When the radiance finally subsided, 2 figures hung suspended above the town. Nethan, his cheeks flushed with embarrassment, and Admiral Kizaru, cool and unflinching in his brilliant yellow glow. In that instant, Nethan's eyes gleamed. He drew in a sharp breath, coiling his ki into a single twisted grin, and then he let loose a thunderous sonic boom. A shockwave tore forward, striking Kizaru's form with enough force to momentarily ripple the Admiral's light body. It was a move Nethan had honed in secret, one he'd never revealed, not even to Kizaru himself. Against a Marine Admiral, he couldn't afford restraint. Unconventional tricks were his only hope. Still, Nethan knew the truth. Conventional light-based attacks were virtually useless against the Logia fruit of light. Kizaru's very essence was pure radiance, intangible and unassailable. No matter how deftly one might twist or bend light, it could never outshine the master of that element, just as no sand manipulator could rival a true sand fruit user on the desert floor. For now, all Nethan could do was steel himself against the brilliance and pray his next gambit would be enough. Nethan's trick caught Kizaru completely off guard. Before the Admiral could react, a sudden, sonic boom exploded around him, ringing his ears and clouding his senses. Seizing the opportunity, Nethan charged in with his fist crackling under a warped gravity field and drove a crushing blow straight at Kizaru's temple. The impact was bone-shaking. Kizaru staggered, unable to dodge, as dizziness washed over him. Nethan pressed the advantage mercilessly. A rising knee strike, rapid punches that rattled Kizaru's defenses, a sweeping leg kick that nearly toppled him, and a sharp side kick that slammed into his ribs. Every attack was delivered with pinpoint precision, exploiting the Admiral's momentary loss of balance. Dazed and still reeling from the sonic blast, Kizaru could only clumsily parry Nethan's onslaught. His reliance on his devil fruit's lightspeed powers proved a double-edged sword. Once disoriented, he had no foothold in close combat. Under Nethan's unrelenting barrage, the great Admiral found himself exposed, vulnerable to blows he couldn't dodge, and unable to regain the initiative. In only a handful of strikes, Nethan shattered Kizaru's guard and drove his knee straight into the Admiral's midsection. A guttural "ugh" ripped from Kizaru as he spat blood, sensation of his torso being crushed like split timber. Around them, sailors who'd witnessed Nethan massacring the Tianlong crew, and who'd already seen Admiral Kizaru turn his weapons on Nethan, lifted their heads in stunned silence. Had they really just seen the Navy's own shining light reduced to spewing blood by a single knee strike? But Nethan wasn't finished. Reading Kizaru's desperate attempt to recover, he let out a fierce battle cry, laced his fingers together like the head of a hammer, and unleashed his signature twisted hammer. Kizaru managed to cross his arms overhead, desperately trying to block the blow, yet Nethin's force shattered that defense. In a flash of golden light, the admiral was sent sprawling across the deck. For a moment, there was only silence, broken only by the heavy thud of Kizaru hitting wood and the ragged breathing of both combatants as Nethin stood triumphantly over the fallen admiral. Chapter 154, Escape Part 4. The earth trembled beneath a thunderous roar as a wave of golden light burst forth, reducing several buildings to rubble. From high above, Nethin had struck first, his blow staggering Admiral Kizaru. Without a moment's hesitation, Nethin activated both his light distortion and sound distortion techniques in unison. In an instant, he vanished from sight and shot into the distance, leaving nothing but a faint afterimage in the sky. When the radiance finally faded, Kizaru's battered form lay sprawled on the ground. He coughed violently, a thin trickle of blood glinting at the corner of his mouth. His eyes blazed with fury. Never before had any foe, not even one of the four emperors, dealt him such a crushing blow. Realizing that Nethin was making his escape, Kizaru's features hardened. In a flash, his body shimmered and transformed into pure golden light. With blinding speed, he launched himself into the heavens, determined to catch the fleeing swordsman. "Do you think you can get away after pulling such a cowardly stunt?" Kizaru's voice crackled through the air like distant thunder. High above the battlefield, Nethin didn't falter. He hovered for a heartbeat, wind whipping through his hair. With a decisive motion, he drew the legendary sword Chunle from its sheath at his waist. The blade gleamed as he channeled every ounce of his strength into it. "Twisted sword!" Nethin roared, slashing into the open sky. A rippling arc of distorting energy blazed along the sword's edge, streaking toward the relentless golden light that marked Kizaru's pursuit. Nethin's blade shimmered as he poured his twisting power into it. With a sharp downward thrust, guided by Rhodes's steady grip, the sword unleashed a straight, crackling beam that cut diagonally toward Kizaru. For a heartbeat, the admiral's golden aura wavered. Then, with a casual flick of his wrist, he formed a radiant, yellow-hued blade and swung it back at Nethin. "Tiankong Yunjian!" Nethin roared, channeling every ounce of his moonstep footwork and warped gravity technique into the strike. His attack met Kizaru's luminous sword in midair with an ear-splitting boom. Sparks and shockwaves rippled outward, but the admiral's mastery of his devil fruit gift proved superior. Weaving through the crisscross slashes, Kizaru forced his way past Nethin's guard and closed the distance in an instant. Above them, the golden cloud sword, its edge gleaming like dawn, came crashing down on Chunle. For a fleeting second, blade met blade in perfect stalemate. Then Nethin's twisting power collapsed. He lost his footing, and his grip on Chunle faltered. With a curse, he plummeted earthward. Midair, Rhodes spun sideways to intercept. In a flash, Kizaru dissolved into streaks of yellow light and rocketed forward. His boot slammed into Nethin's side with brutal force. Rhodes, arms already swinging, met the attack with a savage backhand that sent Kizaru staggering, and the battle raged on. Nethin hurtled through the air as fists and boots collided around him. Mid-flight, he warped his trajectory with a surge of twisted gravity, redirecting himself toward the shoreline. In his right hand, he clutched the gleaming blade Chunle, while the other brandished the 8-foot Chingo Jade, its surface pulsing with latent power. Across the void, Kizaru brought his palms together. The convoluted runes on his Tiankong cloud sword shimmered, then exploded into golden photons, and the sword itself vanished. Boom, boom, boom. The Chingo Jade answered in kind, unleashing seismic laser beams that carved through the battlefield like thunderous artillery fire. Each beam scorched the earth, sending up geysers of dust and stone. When the last burst faded, Nethin staggered from the haze, momentarily off balance. He roared, "Twisting strike!" Seizing both weapons, he launched Chunle in a fierce arc. The blade's aura knotted the air into an invisible cyclone, tearing at the very fabric of the void as it surged forward. Whoosh! Whoosh! Kizaru dodged with inhuman swiftness, his form bull, erring past the spiraling attack. He hovered for a split second, studying Nethin's next move, then twisted his body and plunged back into the fray, determined to turn the tide of this aerial duel. After a frantic chase along the shoreline, they finally skidded to a halt at the water's edge. "Kizaru's here. Ready yourselves," Lafitte shouted as he leapt back onto the ship. On deck, everyone was staring wide-eyed at the duel unfolding below, the golden streaks of Admiral Kizaru's light powers clashing with Nethin's dark figure. A hush fell over the crowd as the two combatants drew closer. In an instant, Kizaru materialized within Robin's reach. Seizing the moment, she thrust her hand forward and commanded, "Blooming 30 flowers, claws." Thanks to the Hana Hana no Mi, Robin could summon phantom arms from any surface in her vicinity, and her technique ignored how fast her target was moving. Dozens of spectral claws erupted from the sand, lunging at the Admiral. Boom! Kizaru's form scattered into golden particles, then snapped back together almost before anyone could blink. But when the light faded, fresh lines marred his weathered face. Nithin glanced at Robin with a proud smile. Not long ago, during their first encounter, she'd been frozen solid after only a few exchanges. That defeat had strengthened her resolve, and now, though her blow still couldn't fell an admiral, it had left a mark. Even Kizaru had to pay attention. Chapter title: Slaughterhouse. Just as Robin lunged to disrupt Kizaru, Luo activated his devil fruit power. A translucent dome erupted around Nethin in midair. With a single precise flick of his finger, Nethin vanished and then rematerialized aboard the Thousand Sunny. In the exact spot he'd occupied seconds before, Lafitte's bomb appeared with a hiss of compressed air. Frozen in a horizontal kick stance, Kizaru barely had time to react before the device detonated at his feet. "No need to send it far, Yellow Monkey," Nethin called, his voice cool over the roar of battle. He swept his arm through the air, channeling a spiraling force that sent a towering wall of seawater crashing against the ship's hull and plunged the entire vessel beneath the waves. Facing Admiral Aokiji, diving below the surface is a death sentence. He can freeze the sea in an instant and pursue his prey through the ice-choked depths. But against Kizaru, it's the exact opposite. Force him into the water, and he's helpless. Light-based devil fruit users cannot submerge, nor can they manipulate ice. As the bomb's shockwave rippled outward, Kizaru collapsed into a beam of golden light and streaked toward the heart of the explosion, ready to strike back. Kizaru never saw it coming. One moment, the vessel floated on the waves. The next, Nithin's distortion power had ripped its very timbers apart and sent the wreck hurtling beneath the surface. It wasn't just that the ship had no protective coating. Nithin's technique was simply too swift, too brutal to counter. And with Robin, Lua, and Lafitte throwing themselves into the fray, Kizaru couldn't marshal his light fruit powers fast enough to patch the hull or hold it in place. The Admiral gritted his teeth. He was no spring chicken, but aging or not, he could not freeze an entire sea. Crossing his arms, he unleashed a massive burst of solar light, hoping to obliterate whatever and whoever had plunged with the ship. For 30 seconds straight, torrents of scorching photons pounded the spot where the boat had vanished. The water steamed and roiled under the bombardment, yet no distant plank nor shadow of an enemy emerged. Not a trace. He knew the rules. Anyone who ventured below the waves lost the benefits of a devil fruit. Such a move was a double-edged sword, suicidal if you couldn't breathe or swim on your own. But Nethin was no fool. If he chose to drag the ship down, he must have a plan to survive underwater. Kizaru's lips curled into a cold smile as the sea settled back into placid calm. So this was Nethin's gambit. Now it was time to see if the young man truly had the strength to back it up, or if he'd simply drowned himself in bravado. The yellow monkey blurred into a shaft of golden light and swept back to the shoreline, its eyes fixed on the sea with an anguished, almost bewildered expression. It had achieved virtually nothing on this mission, failed to stop Nithin from slaughtering the Tianlong people, failed to restrain him, and hadn't even managed to capture a single member of the Ghost Hand Pirates. This time, there was simply no excuse. Nethin gave the order, and Kizuna unleashed his Bachi Chiongo beam into the open sea. The blast fanned out to cover a broad swath of water, hunting for any enemy vessel or submarine below. Instead, it struck the ship sailing under Rhodes's twisting barrier at the very edge of its range. The lasers tore through the barrier, but by then their velocity and power had been sapped. The hull barely felt a scratch. The ship slipped away unscathed, and in moments, Kizaru's brilliant beams winked out on the horizon. That was Admiral Kizaru, Nethan murmured, easing his grip on the hilt of his sword. With a soft click, he slid Griku back into its scabbard. He must have eaten one of those devil fruits of his. Admirals really do get the best. Robin, leaning against the deck rail, kept his eyes trained on the sea's shimmering surface. After a pause, he shifted his gaze back to Nethan. His speed, it's unbelievable, like wings slicing through the air, almost impossible to lock onto. Still, there's an opening if we move right. Nethan sheathed Chun-Lei at his side and narrowed the perimeter of the twisting wall barrier, hoping to conserve his strength. His keen eyes gleamed as he spoke. You see, Robin, Luo, the speed fruit isn't bound by our bodies in the same way. Its acceleration can outpace nerve signals, but you still can't bypass what your body can handle. One devil fruit allows you to exceed reaction time. The other tests your physical limits. Both have their own checks, or they'd be unstoppable. Robin and Luo exchanged understanding looks. Luo, whose surgical fruit lets him swap places with any particle of sand, stone, or even air within his room field, nodded thoughtfully. Nethan glanced at Luo. Yours seems limitless, but it costs you dearly, right? The spatial shifts demand massive energy. Luo offered a half smile. True, I can blink from here to next door in an instant, but each teleport drains me. My endurance caps how much I can do. Nethan relaxed his stance. So every power has its edge. Good. That means we've all got our strengths and our vulnerabilities. With that, he tightened his grip on the hilt of Chun-Lei, ready for whatever came next. Robin and Nethan were both lost in thought when Lafitte lifted his gaze and addressed Captain Rhodes. By the way, Captain, I picked this up from the Don Quixote family earlier. With a deft flick of his wrist, he produced a small, ornate devil fruit, one of the 3 prized specimens Kaku's team had recovered from Gradius, the rust fruit. Natural-type devil fruits have distinctive appearances, and Nethan recognized it instantly. Unlike Paramecia, whose shapes vary wildly, or zoans, which bear animal motifs, natural fruits often echo their element. The flame fruit, for example, is patterned in flickering embers. Turning the rust fruit over in his hand, Nethan let out a low chuckle. The Don Quixote family's trade network really is vast. They know how to keep their secrets. Ho ho ho, Lafitte replied, lifting the brim of his top hat and giving Rhodes a sly nod. Nethan stood on deck as dusk settled over the open sea, the sky painted in bruised purples and fiery reds. Beside him, Robin and Luo leaned on the rail, the ocean breeze tugging at their coats. Nethan closed the wooden crate at his feet with a soft click. We still have to deal with the Don Quixote family, he said, lifting his gaze from the box. And one of the key reasons is Trafalgaro, the ship's doctor. He's more than capable, but right now the devil fruit he needs is off limits. Robin nodded, her dark eyes thoughtful. Trafalgaro's skills have gotten us out of tight spots before. It's a shame we can't call on that fruit. Luo cracked his knuckles. Between you, me, and Trafalgaro, and if you include Robin, there's nothing we can't handle. 4 strong fighters, each with our own specialties. We'll be fine. Nethan walked over to the crate and lifted the fruit inside. Its surface rippled like a storm-tossed sea, what sailors sometimes call the rumbling fruit. He turned it over in his hand, frowning. It still hasn't sang for me, an old naval term for a devil fruit's awakening. But don't worry, a fruit that's properly mastered becomes a formidable weapon. He set it back inside and secured the lid. Scanning the horizon, he plotted their next move. We'd planned to fly in from the Red Soil continent, but now that we're already at sea, it makes more sense to stop at Fishman Island first. That way, we avoid the risk of crossing the sky route. The yellow ape patrols that airspace, and I'd rather not test my luck against something that big. Robin consulted a star chart. Fishman Island it is. We'll regroup there, resupply, and then head north. Nethan closed his eyes, listening to the waves. Good. Let's get some rest tonight. Tomorrow, our real journey begins. Deep within Dressrosa's royal castle, Don Quixote do Flamingo lounged on a velvet sofa. A carved obsidian phone bug rested by his elbow, and he listened to the whispers crackling through its earpiece. A slow, wicked smile spread across his face. They actually went to the Chambord Islands and killed Charmark? He flicked ash from his cigarette and leaned back, eyes gleaming with dark amusement. Interesting. Very interesting indeed. Nethen had been carefully tracking every rumor about the Ghost Hand pirates. Their mighty flagship was destroyed, and even the notorious giant axe duelist Siru had vanished from the bounty rolls, leaving only Nethen's crew still at large. Now just a captain and 3 officers remained fugitives, scrambling like cornered dogs. Then the most astonishing news arrived. They'd slipped into the Chambord Islands and assassinated a member of the Celestial Dragons in cold blood as an act of revenge. Deep within his marble fortress, Doflamingo, a man who'd once been one of the Tenryubito himself, could barely contain his glee. Stripped of his noble status after a bitter scandal, he'd even delivered his own father's head to Mary Giois, only to be denied reinstatement. He'd never forgiven the Celestials, or the Charmark family in particular, who'd led the charge against restoring his heritage. A low, mirthless laugh rattled through the grand hall as he pictured the uproar this murder would cause. At his side, Toripol slithered forward across the polished floor, streaks of mucus glistening on his chin. He grinned up at Doflamingo with wicked satisfaction. "Imagine it," he rasped, voice quivering with excitement. "The Ghost Hand pirates actually killed a celestial dragon. That's the sweetest news I've heard in ages." Doflamingo leaned back, basking in the chaos he knew was about to erupt among the world government's highest circles. In that moment, nothing had ever felt more deliciously inevitable. Doflamingo and Treble had just finished savoring the news of the Ghost Hand pirate's latest atrocity, killing a celestial dragon, when the transponder snail on the table buzzed insistently. Still smiling, Doflamingo reached out and picked it up. "I apologize for the interruption, young master," came Gradius's flat voice through the snail. "Something's gone wrong with the fruit exchange." Doflamingo's grin vanished in an instant. Tribble, who had been leaning back in his chair, frowned and spat. "What do you mean it's gone wrong? Who would dare sabotage a transaction arranged by the Don Quixote family, especially in broad daylight?" "I'll take full responsibility, sir," Gradius continued evenly. "The circumstances were unusual. We couldn't identify our attacker directly, but every lead points to Lafitte of the Ghost Hand pirates." Silence fell across the grand chamber. Even the faint crackle of the fireplace seemed to pause in that moment, as though the walls themselves were bracing for Doflamingo's reaction. Doflamingo's trademark grin was gone. His face was locked in a rigid mask of disbelief. Word of the Ghost Hand pirates' latest atrocity swept across the Grand Line like a typhoon. Under the command of the mysterious Nethen, they had struck the Chambord archipelago, slaughtered the celestial dragon Charmak, and dared to slug it out, with Admiral Kizaru himself, leaving the Marine Battle Admiral coughing up blood. Overnight, that single raid ignited every set of headlines: Celestial Dragon slain, Battle Admiral battered. Only weeks ago, rumors of Nethen's crew had rattled the world's powers. They'd been on their last legs, harried by the Navy and government forces. Everyone expected them to crumble. Now the tables had turned so completely that the entire world fell silent in shock. In the span of one night, the Ghost Hand pirates had gone from doomed underdogs to the most feared force on the seas, and from this point forward, no one would ever underestimate them again. Chapter 156, 1 Billion Berry Reward. Marine headquarters was in utter chaos. Admirals hurried through the marbled corridors, worry and cold sweat on their brows. In the top-floor war room, Fleet Admiral Sengoku pressed his temples, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. They'd dispatched Admiral Aokiji, the Ice Fist, to pursue the notorious Ghost Hand Rhodes, but Rhodes had slipped away into the skies. At sea, Captain Kobe mounted a second chase, only to see Rhodes vanish once more. Worse still, intelligence confirmed that Rhodes had struck on the Sabaudi archipelago, and in full view of witnesses, cold-bloodedly assassinated a celestial dragon. Sengoku slammed his fist on the table. The entire room seemed to shudder. Before he could shout orders, his secure line buzzed. He recognized the caller instantly. "Fleet Admiral Sengoku," barked the gravelly voice on the other end. "General Monkey D. Garp," Sengoku replied, snapping to attention. "Explain," Garp demanded. Rhythmic typing filled a tense second. "Sir," Sengoku said, "Rhodes murdered a world noble on Sabaudi. He evaded both Aokiji's sky pursuit and Kobe's naval squadron. He remains at large in the archipelago." A long, low whistle came through the line. "The celestial dragons are already convening on Mary Joa, blasting our name in every corridor." Garp growled. This isn't just a breach of protocol, it's an outright challenge to the world government. Understood, sir, Sengoku acknowledged. Here's what you'll do, Garp continued, voice as hard as iron. Immediately mobilize the Warring States strike force. Dispatch Admirals Aokiji and Kizaru to Sabati at full speed. Reinforce every nearby base. Declare Rhodes wanted, dead or alive, with a reward of 1 billion berries. 1 billion berries, Sengoku repeated, voice tight. And not a single civilian operative, Garp added. This is strictly a Navy affair. Report only to me. Yes, sir, Sengoku replied, slamming down the handset. He turned to his staff. Print the wanted posters. 1 billion berries, dead or alive. Let every Marine know that Rhodes is our highest priority. Messengers raced off. Communications officers lit up with orders. Across the world, Marine contingents braced for the manhunt that would define this era, and for the reckoning one rogue pirate would bring down on the Navy. And at the eye of the storm stood Rhodes, hailed by some as Ghost Hand, cursed by all as murderer of royalty. The Navy was about to learn just how dangerous he truly was. Yes, Marshal Kong. Sengoku's brow knotted in frustration. His fists clenched so tightly his knuckles whitened. Anger roiled in his chest, but there was nothing he could do except keep one ear glued to the transponder. Inside the conference room at Marine headquarters, 6 officers were gathered. Fleet Admiral Sengoku himself, Admirals Aokiji, Kizaru, and Akainu, and Vice Admirals Tsuru and Garp. Ha! So the brat really did kill a celestial dragon? Garp boomed the moment he strode in, having just caught wind of the news. His loud guffaw pierced the tense silence like a hammer blow. Cap! Sengoku snapped, his glare cutting across the room. Must you laugh at a time like this? Don't you understand the severity of the situation? Garp suppressed another chuckle, giving Sengoku a casual wave. In Garp's eyes, the world nobles were nothing but scum. Any one of them falling was a cause for celebration. That contempt was exactly why he'd turned down every offer of promotion to Admiral. Once he's promoted to Admiral, if the Celestial Dragons feel insulted, the world government will have to dispatch him at once to placate them with a show of force. That's exactly the sort of humiliation Garp would never tolerate, so of course he'd refuse to kowtow to the dragons. Fleet Admiral Sengoku's face went ashen, but he dared not argue with Garp. Instead, he turned to the 2 remaining admirals and said, Kizaru, Aokiji, come with me to Mary Giois. At the sound of that, Kizaru's usual easygoing grin vanished. He sagged slightly, not out of fear, but under the weight of his own mistake. Ever since earning his admiral's stars, he'd managed to stir up more trouble than he'd ever wanted. Beside him, Aokiji's expression darkened too. His contempt for the celestial dragons was no secret, and he knew that if only they'd captured Nethan back in the Devil's Triangle, none of this would be happening. Even Admiral Sakazuki looked grim, though he'd had no hand in the fiasco. Every time Nethan's name came up, Sakazuki ended up implicated by association. This time, it really was a complete mess, courtesy of one extraordinary young man. Crane watched Senguo and Chinji stride out of the room, shaking his head in mild exasperation. A flicker of amusement danced in his sharp eyes. Garp rummaged through a drawer, found a pack of senbei, and settled onto the sofa. Crunching thoughtfully, he said, Let that fellow go be a pirate hunter. I'm fine with it. Outside the war room, Admiral Akainu's boots clicked as he strode down the corridor. The entire episode had unfolded in full view of every officer present, too sudden to suppress and far too public to cover up. By the time the Navy and the government tried to spin it, the moment had already passed. Chaos reigned in their ranks. 3 days later, the world's attention turned to the latest bounty announcements. The Ghost Hand pirates found themselves thrust into the spotlight. Trafalgaro, the so-called death surgeon, watched his bounty rise to 60 million berries. Nico Robin, branded the Demon Child, saw hers climb to 120 million. Lafitte's reward reached 200 million. But the true shocker was the captain himself. Rhodes, the Ghost Hand and mastermind behind the massacre of the Tenryubito, now carried a staggering 1 billion berry bounty. Whether for eluding an admiral or slaughtering world nobles, no crime seemed too great for a price tag of that caliber. Such a bounty needn't linger half-finished. In the latter half of the Grand Line's new world, it would shoot him straight to the summit, on par with the 4 emperors and the feared 3 disasters, ranking only behind the 4 sea kings. In other words, emperor status. And yet, Rhodes and his crew had no inkling of any of this. 9 kilometers below the surface, the sea's crushing weight was overwhelming. Darkness had long since swallowed the waters, and Nethan's twisted barrier, a ring of distorted energy, had shrunk so tightly it nearly brushed the ship's hull. At this depth, even seasoned mariners like Rhodes couldn't be sure how far they were from the true ocean floor. Official records placed Fishman Island at 10,000 meters down, but those figures were more legend than fact. The island was a perfect sphere less than 10 kilometers across, so it must lie even deeper. 10,000 meters was simply a stand-in for incredibly deep. Time stretched on under that harrowing pressure. Sweat beaded on Nethan's brow as he fought to maintain the barrier that kept the crushing sea at bay. Then, through the stifling gloom, a faint glow appeared, light from the distant seabed. At long last, they were almost home. From the direction of the glow, a tiny planet suddenly appeared below the waves, an island enclosed in a vast, double-layered bubble, floating eerily on the ocean floor. At last, we'd arrived. This was the legendary Fishman Island. Robin stood close beside Nethan, her earlier anxiety melting away the moment the island came into view. Her eyes sparkled as she took in the sight. Luo and Lafitte, typically so reserved, had also gathered at the bow, their faces betraying the same mixture of awe and excitement. Nethan said nothing. Drawing on his distortion powers, he guided the ship straight toward the bubble. Every push drained him more deeply. His stamina, already stretched thin by his persistent stubbornness, was nearly gone. Yet, when Fishman Island finally filled the viewport, he pushed himself even harder. The submerging vessel, which had drifted down at a steady pace, sprang forward under Nethan's command. Rather than approach the main Nantrance, he angled the bow upward and shot diagonally through the bubble's outer layer. Whoom! The ship burst through the wall of shimmering water, leaving ripples dancing across the surface as we plunged into Fishman Island's hidden depths. Fishman Island lay ahead, encircled by twin layers of shimmering bubbles. Between those two walls of air, no seawater dared to intrude. Any ordinary ship that tried to ram through would simply be yanked down to the ocean floor. Nethan's vessel, however, showed no such weakness. As it pierced the outer bubble, the ship shuddered for a moment, then, by some clever engineering, hovered steadily in mid-water. After all, it's far easier to keep a ship aloft in a cushion of trapped air than to brace it against the crushing pressure of the deep. With a sigh of relief, Nethan watched as they passed through the second bubble barrier. He'd once imagined bypassing Fishman Island entirely, boring straight through the undersea tunnel to reach the new world in one go. Clearly, he'd overestimated both his crew's endurance and the subtle strength of the island's defenses. Yet now, safely inside, the path forward at last lay open. Nethan eased the wheel and guided the ship straight through the second barrier of bubbles. Moments later, they slid onto a stretch of golden sand at the very edge of Fishman Island and came to a smooth, stable stop. On the beach, curious merfolk, some fully human in appearance, others bearing unmistakably piscine features, watched the pirate vessel with a mixture of caution and surprise. If this had been the early days of the Great Pirate Era, any ship flying the Jolly Roger would have sent Fishman Island's inhabitants fleeing in all directions. But that was before Whitebeard had claimed the island as his own. Since then, few pirates dared to approach its shores. Lesser crews were turned back long before they reached the beaches, and only the mightiest captains even contemplated breaching the island's defenses, knowing full well the consequences of provoking the legend of Whitebeard. Lafitte was the first to climb down the gangplank. He surveyed the scene with a broad, approving grin, his eyes following mermen diving gracefully beneath the waves or darting behind coral outcroppings to hide. "Ho, ho, ho," he chuckled, clearly delighted by the rarity of such a sight. Nethan stepped ashore just behind him, scanning the wary faces of the merfolk. He knew well that every step on this sacred land would be watched, and that any misstep could invite disaster. Yet the journey had brought them here for a reason, and there was no turning back now. Luo's hands shook as he gripped the demon knife, tears tracing dirty lines down his cheeks. They don't seem even a little afraid of us pirates," he whispered. Rhodes stepped up beside him, his voice calm and measured. "Why would they be? This is Whitebeard's territory. He gazed out over the sea, eyes steady. If Whitebeard's power truly eclipses that of the world government, then in effect he is the world government. In this world, there are only powers, strong and weak. In the New World, the four emperors have carved their domains so clearly that everything within their borders falls under their protection. At that level, the line between government and pirates disappears. If government means order and pirates mean chaos, then the four emperors have imposed their own order on the seas. Imagine the Whitebeard pirates growing even larger, surpassing the Marines themselves. They wouldn't just be a crew, they'd become the Whitebeard government, and the world government would look like mere outlaws. It sounds impossible, but that's the harsh truth of power. Every year, the world government's celestial dragons demand that every last bit of the world's gold be delivered into their coffers. In practice, it's nothing more than legalized plunder. At its core, the world government is just a vast, well-organized pirate crew masquerading as a governing body. No wonder the talent system now offers bounties for killing Navy officers. It's all about hunting the strong. That's why Lucci earned a hefty reward for taking down CP9, and why slaying someone like Chiwahai counts for big points. But murdering a celestial dragon yields nothing, because in the system's eyes, the dragons are powerless parasites, privileged trash, unworthy of bounty. With this realization, Nethan finally grasped how the talent system truly worked. Satisfied, he turned toward Fishman Island. Breathing deeply of the sea air as he stepped onto its sandy shore, he felt a rare moment of relief. Now that he'd arrived, it was time to rest, and of course, to meet the legendary ancient weapon known as a Sea King, and the mermaid princess, Shirahoshi. Among the three ancient weapons, the one Nethan understands best is the power of the Sea Kings, the ability to communicate with and command these leviathans. In this world, no biological species can rival the Sea Kings. Humans and giants alike must step aside before their might. Consider Jack Elephant Lord Drought, one of the beast pirates' three disasters, carrying the entire island of Zoo on his back and bearing a staggering bounty of 1 billion. Beyond him are Venmore Sea Kings of similar colossal scale. These titans may struggle against the swift admirals or take a beating from a four emperor, but when it comes to leveling islands, they are utterly unstoppable. World-destroying power isn't measured by invincibility, it's measured by the ability to lay waste to the world. If, for example, Baixing issued an order to annihilate every island, not even the combined might of the four emperors and the admirals could prevent countless islands from being crushed beneath the Sea King's might. That is the true terror of commanding the Sea Kings. Whether Uranus, Pluto, or Poseidon, each of the three ancient weapons rivals the destructive power of a nuclear arsenal. Rhodes has no intention of unleashing them until he possesses the strength to master them and protect the poneglyph that binds their secrets. But once he is powerful enough to challenge the four emperors, or even clash with the Navy's very headquarters, those weapons will be his. The moment he releases their full might, the world will quake. On a street paved with gleaming seashells, a battered world government ship had finally drifted to shore. Its hull was splintered, the mainmast snapped in two, and great gashes in its flanks looked as though Sea Kings had chewed away at its timbers. A small crowd of Murlocs and merfolk gathered around the wreck, whispering in astonishment. Suddenly, a single gunshot cracked through the salty air, its report reverberating off the shell-strewn buildings. Whoosh! Whoosh! Beasts, all of them dead, pathetic trash, a hoarse voice spat. Lying on the sand, drenched in blood, was the dragon man Musgarood. He clutched a pistol in one massive hand, the barrel still curling with a wisp of gunpowder smoke. His chest rose and fell in ragged gasps as he fought for breath. Since Jinbei recently accepted the Shichibukai Treaty and was named King of the Seven Warlords, every one of the Murloc slaves has been granted amnesty. Nithan, a proud scion of the Tianlong clan, seethed with indignation. He gathered a handful of Dragonkin warriors, boarded a swift cutter, and set sail for the Murloc archipelago. His mission, reclaim those stolen laborers by force. Halfway there, they ran headlong into a pack of Sea Kings. The Dragonkin fought with ferocity, but they were vastly outnumbered. In the end, every attendant fell defending their master. Nithan alone survived, left bleeding and broken upon the deck. He lay sprawled against the ship's rail, crimson robes stained darker by sweat and salt water. Each breath rattled violently through his ribs. Clutching a pistol in one trembling hand, he trained it on the silent circle of mermen and murlocs that had swarmed the deck. "Bring me a gas mask. This fish stench will choke me to death," he rasped between jagged coughs. "Hurry up, you fools, before I keel over." The murlocs glanced at one another, uncertain. None had ever laid eyes on a Tianlong warrior before. Their queer fins and gills fluttered nervously as they hesitated, unsure whether to offer aid or to seize their chance at revenge. Nethin summoned what remained of his dignity and pushed himself upright. His pistol shook in his hand, but he held it firm. "You idiots," he snarled. "Fetch a doctor now, or so help me, I'll fire on the first creature that dares step closer." Before anyone could move, a row of coral-colored banners snapped open in the sea breeze. The guards of Ryugu Palace spilled onto the deck, their silver tridents gleaming. Well-trained fishman soldiers fanned out, cutting off the circle of onlookers and rushing to Nethin's side. Relief washed over him as one of the palace attendants knelt beside him, pressing a damp cloth to his wounds. Though battered and outnumbered, Nethin had won another, unexpected reprieve, and as his vision blurred, he vowed that this would not be the last he saw of the Murloc archipelago. Captain Arlen surveyed the tense tableau before him, then turned to the nearest guard. "Where is the medical team?" The guard swallowed. "They're here, sir, but what should we do with him?" A heavy silence fell. As residents of Fishman Island, none of them felt the slightest sympathy for the Tenryubito. They loathed the celestial dragon's haughty imperiousness. And yet, even as Muscarud lay dying, he continued to bark orders and fling insults, treating them like mere servants. Before anyone could answer, a ripple ran through the assembled soldiers. Emerging from the shadows, the Murloc enforcers of the Sun Pirates, led by Jinpei, drifted forward in perfect formation. Each carried a wicked blade, their eyes locked on Muscarud with unmistakable malice. Several of these Murlocs had once been Muscarud's slaves. Now they remembered every indignity. "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" one startled guard shouted, but the Sun Pirates paid him no heed. Their leader's grim nod was all the signal they needed. Step by measured step, they advanced, weapons poised. The air crackled with their silent vow. This celestial dragon would answer for his crimes. "Nethin, seize him. He's a Tianlong official. If you kill him, the Chiwuhai amnesty will be voided." One of the Sun Pirates barked the warning, but the Murlocs paid him no mind. Their leader stepped forward, drew a battered flintlock pistol, and trained it squarely on Muscarud, who was slumped and bleeding on the reef. "On land, your royal commission shields you, sent by your admiral's grace," the Murloc snarled, his voice echoing through the underwater grotto. "Down here, nobody hears your king's orders. As long as the islanders keep their mouths shut, this will be written off as just another maritime accident." At his words, the surrounding Murlocs and mermaids snapped to attention. A chorus of guttural shouts erupted. "Silence! No one breathes a word." Their previous hesitation vanished, replaced by savage glee. Some clutched rusty tridents, others brandished barbed nets, eager to finish off the wounded guard. The pirate commander's eyes glittered with malice as he raised the pistol. Muscarud's shallow breaths rattled through the cool water. Then, flash! The hammer fell. But before the shot could claim its victim, a figure lunged in from the side, slamming his shoulder against Muscarud's back. Two muffled cracks rang out. Water churned with panic as the Murlocs recoiled. Nethin grunted, teeth gritted against the searing pain that tore through his shoulder. His arms wrapped instinctively around Muscarud, shielding him from the second blast. Blood blossomed across Nethin's shirt, but he held firm, every ounce of resolve focused on keeping Muscarud alive. For a heartbeat, all was still. Then the pirates stirred, their snarls of triumph replaced by stunned silence. Nethin stayed pressed against Muscarud's frail form, determined that no more harm would come to the wounded officer, no matter the cost. Prince Nethin of Fishman Island, His Royal Highness, the young prince himself. At the sight of him, wounded and collapsing to one knee, every Murloc and mermaid in the courtyard froze. No one had expected Nethin to throw himself between the celestial dragons and their attackers, and to take a blow for it. At once, the trained marksmen lowered their weapons, uncertainty rippling through their ranks. A bead of sweat trickled down Nethan's cheek as he struggled to lift his head. His dark eyes met the barrel of a gun held by a nearby murloc. Through clenched teeth, he forced out a steady if strained command. Stand down. Spare them. He fought the pain in his side and the compassion in his heart. He could not stand by and watch the celestial dragons be slaughtered. Yet he also understood these Yamato murlocs. Rescuing the dragons might open a new path to respect and equality for all fishmen. Not far off, 6-year-old Princess Shirahoshi and the other 3 royal princes pressed forward, panic and worry on their faces. They had never seen Nethan injured before, least of all risking himself for those who had long looked down on their people. Nethan's voice wavered as he added, "Lower your weapons, please." But before the murlocs could obey, a guttural shout came from behind him. Muscarud, grim-faced and bleeding from a wound he just received, staggered upright. With a roar of rage, he seized his rifle and aimed it squarely at Nethan. The courtyard fell deathly silent. Every pair of eyes and every fishman's heart stood poised between mercy and vengeance. The moment Muscarud's pistol barked, the faces of every nearby murloc went slack with horror. Jin Ping, standing among them, let out a desperate cry and lunged forward, but it was far too late. The bullet ripped toward Princess Otoji with a thunderous crack. Muscarud's trembling wrist sent it veering just wide of her, until an invisible force tore through the air, striking the round mid-flight. In an instant, the bullet exploded into dust. The shockwave drove into the ground beneath it, gouging a slender, bottomless shaft no wider than a finger. High atop a nearby shell-like tower, a lone figure withdrew his outstretched hand. In the next heartbeat, he stepped into the clearing with an effortless stride. Nethan's cool gaze swept the stunned murlocs as he bowed slightly toward the princess. "Your Highness," he declared. Whispers rippled through the crowd. "It's a human?" While many stared at Otoji with wide-eyed relief and fear. A few others glanced at Nethan himself, breathing hard at his sudden, impossible arrival. Princess Yiji froze as the distant crack of a firearm echoed across the clearing. Only then did she realize the shot had come from the Tianlong soldiers lying in ambush behind her. She turned to the newcomer who had appeared out of nowhere, Nethan, recalling that single gunshot and feeling her own unbroken skin. Relief and shock passed over her face in equal measure before she understood the cruel truth. One who betrays you once will surely betray you again. Nethan's pale eyes swept over Muscarud, then locked onto Otoji as she leaped forward to protect him. Without a flicker of hesitation, he leveled his pistol and fired directly at his savior. Yiji's heart sank. Only a Tianlong villain could repay mercy with treachery. Rhodes stepped between the two factions. He felt Yiji's anxious stare, but before she could speak, he raised a hand to still her. "Your Highness," he said, voice low and steady, "allow me to handle this soldier. You." Otoji stood rooted to the spot, every nerve tingling. Nethan was unquestionably human. She could see that as clearly as day, but his features stirred some faint, unplaceable memory in her mind. What did this man intend to do, planted like a spy within the ranks of the Tianlong? She opened her mouth to warn the princess, to demand action, but a contingent of royal guards crashed in around them. Steel breastplates clanged as they formed a protective ring. "Your Highness, step back," the captain barked. "You will not risk yourself any further." "You can't!" Otoji managed to shout, but the guards ignored her pleas. They shepherded the princess away, heedless of the turmoil in Otoji's eyes. Nethan stood alone now among the scattered banners and fallen leaves, the smoke from his revolver drifting into the still air. Seeing him so exposed, Otoji strained against the guard's grip. She had to know. Finally, with the princess safely out of reach, Otoji blurted out, "You're human." Her voice wavered on the edge of disbelief. "Damn it, what did you just say?" But before Nethan could answer, they were gone. Princess Yiji's retinue vanishing over the crest of the hill, leaving Otoji to wrestle with 1,000 unanswered questions. Nethan's sudden arrival sent a jolt through Muscarud. He'd never expected a human to appear, and even more, to have the audacity to call him trash. Rage flared in the noble's chest. Clenching his jaw, he fumbled for his pistol and raised it, determined to fire. Before he could steady his aim, a shot cracked through the air. "Thinking of killing him, sir?" came a cool voice at Muscarud's side. Captain Lafitte stood there, his own pistol trained on Musgarud's temple. A thin, menacing smile curved his lips. Musgarud froze. A gun pressed against his head. He'd never known fear like this. His hand shook so badly he nearly dropped his weapon. "You can't stop this! I'm Tianlong nobility. How dare you?" He stammered, panic rising. He'd assumed no mere human would defy him. Nethan stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. "Do you even know Charmark?" he asked quietly, his tone threaded with both disbelief and warning. Musgarud coughed violently, his vision swirling from the severity of his wounds. "Saint Charmak? He's dead. I killed him," Nethan said, his voice unnervingly calm. Musgarud's face went pale, horror and disbelief warring in his eyes. Who in their right mind would dare slay a Tianlong saint? Stricken by shock and agony, he gasped once more, his eyes rolled back, and he collapsed into unconsciousness. Lafitte didn't lower his rifle. He kept it trained on the fallen man, waiting for Nethan's command. Nethan studied Musgarud's still form, without a flicker of emotion. He raised a hand as if to signal Lafitte stand down, but then paused. Better to keep Musgarud alive. Let Luo tend his injuries. He might prove useful yet. After all, Nethan had already killed one Tianlong warrior. There was no harm in sparing another for the time being. Luo's surgical fruit bestowed many extraordinary procedures, among them the mind exchange operation, a method capable of swapping bodies or transferring consciousness and soul between two people. For that uncanny process, a live subject was essential. In many ways, this power is like a form of eternal surgery, except that replacing bodies costs a fortune. Luo hasn't yet learned the mind transfer procedure, but with enough practice he will. When he does, this Tianlong warrior could become incredibly valuable. After all, choosing to die in a place of true meaning beats fading away on Fishman Island. Princess Otoji frowned as she watched Lafitte herding the Tenyo captives away. "Wait, where are you taking him?" she called out. She hadn't heard what Nethan said. His voice-distorting mask meant only Rafi could understand him, but Lafitte merely inclined his head in acknowledgement. "I'll see him delivered safely," the smuggler replied curtly, gesturing for the guards to move on. Nethan turned to Princess Yiji and offered her a calm smile. "This isn't the place for a proper conversation," he said. "Would you escort me to Ryugu Palace City? I have urgent matters to discuss." Yiji's eyes flicked to the assembled Murlocs standing guard. She remembered all too well that the Tenyo had tried to assassinate her and that someone mysterious had saved her life. Glancing back at Nethan, she nodded. "Lead the way," she said. As the small entourage began its cautious advance, Commander Jingping's face suddenly went pale. Recognition dawned in his eyes as he whispered hoarsely to a nearby aide, "Your Highness, that's Captain Nethan of the Ghost Hand Pirates." The name alone was enough to stun them. News of Nethan's epic clash with a dragon and his duel against a fearsome marine admiral had not yet reached Fishman Island, but his 440 million berry bounty was the talk of every port. Even without the untold victories, such a pirate was a legend in his own right, and now he marched beside the very princess he had rescued. Nethan stood at the water's edge, rain-slick sand crunching underfoot. Before him lay the great sand crocodile, one of the legendary seven seas beasts, slain by his hand. A ripple of shocked awe ran through the assembly. Otoji watched him coolly, nodding once. She had understood Nethan's true role long before Commander Jinping did, but she said nothing. She bore no ill will toward pirates, and this was hardly the moment for accusations. Jinping, his face drawn, redirected his attention to the crowd of Murlocs and mermen gathered around them. He knew better than to provoke Nethan here, especially not with so many witnesses and with the princess herself in attendance. If conflict arose, he had no way to guarantee the safety of everyone present. He took a steadying breath. "Let this matter end now," he called out, voice firm. "The Tianlong affair stops here. I ask that none of you speak of it again." The sea folk murmured among themselves. They respected Jinping. His years of leadership had earned him real prestige, and one by one they bowed their heads in acquiescence. Still, Rhodes, ever cautious, sighed and signaled to Lafayette. With a few whispered words and a swirl of arcane light, Lafayette cast a gentle charm over the assembled crowd. Their memories of the crocodile's slaughter would fade like footprints in the tide. Only Shipping and Yiji, standing close beside the princess, remained untouched by the spell. Now, Rhodes said quietly. "Let us hurry and tend to her royal highness." He gestured toward the princess, whose pale cheeks and trembling lips clearly showed she had been through a fright. Together, they formed a protective circle around her, turning their concern away from dragons of sand and toward the fragile human life before them. The storm-racked shore fell silent, save for the princess's shallow breaths, and for the first time in far too long, peace seemed to stretch its hand across the waves. The Guard Corps' medical team arrived in an instant. They slid Otoji onto a stretcher and quickly set to work dressing the wound in her shoulder. At the same moment, the young princes and princesses, Shark Star, White Star, and the others, hurried over, flanked by attendants, and all of them followed the medics toward Dragon Palace City. Otoji offered a reassuring smile to Shark Star, White Star, and the rest. "I'm fine, really," she called softly, raising a hand in a gentle wave. "No need to worry." Then she turned her gaze to Nethan, who stood a short distance away, and added, "Don't forget to thank him properly." With Otoji's back still turned to the dragonfolk, Shark Star, White Star, and the others now had an unobstructed view of Nethan. He was only human, yet in that moment their relief was unmistakable. "Thank you, Nethan-sama," White Star breathed, her large doe-like eyes glistening with unshed tears. If not for Nethan's timely intervention, she would have awakened Neptune's power. She would have called on Neptune herself, but now that chance was gone. Nethan returned her smile with quiet warmth. At only 6 years old, White Star already stood taller than he did, and Otoji was even more slender and fragile. It seemed impossible that the two were mother and daughter. Could Neptune really have had an affair? Nethan watched them with a sly smile. So this is the mermaid princess Baixing at last. Robin stepped onto the observation deck and gazed at Shirahoshi and the other merfolk walking before Otoji. She tapped her chin in thought. The legendary ancient weapon, Sea King Poseidon. Nethan's eyes glinted. In a low, altered voice he replied, "I've been holding back her awakening. If she'd triggered it openly, we'd have needed Lafitte to erase every memory around here. But Shirahoshi is a mermaid princess. Sooner or later, that power will surface on its own." Robin's expression flickered. What really happened in the Void Century? Why do the poneglyphs still stand? Why would the world government conceal weapons capable of destroying the world? A tangle of questions pressed on her mind. And yet, having joined the Ghost Hand Pirates and come this far into the calm belt, the distance between her and the truth no longer felt impossible to cross. Ahead lay the grand hall of Ryugu Palace, its massive carved pillars rising like ancient sentinels. Here, Robin knew, her journey into history's deepest secrets was about to begin. After Yiji was carried back into Ryugu Palace City, she was rushed straight to the infirmary for treatment. Rhodes, meanwhile, escorted the others to the palace's great audience hall. Words alone cannot capture its splendor. Walls encrusted with lustrous pearls and vibrant corals, jeweled columns that outshone even the grandest human castles. Every corner of Ryugu Castle overflowed with treasures hidden in the ocean's depths. In the center of that magnificence, Nethan reclined on a carved shell throne. Opposite him stood Jinbei of the Deep Sea, whose rank and reputation normally barred him from palace affairs. But in light of Nethan's arrival, an unpredictable, dangerous presence, they had bent protocol to have Jinbei here as well. Beyond the palace gates lay the vast Chiwu Sea, its surface calm yet concealing relentless currents below. Jinbei's composed expression spoke of his mastery over those depths. Once Nethan had taken in the hall's beauty, he returned his gaze to Jinbei, eyes glinting with unreadable intent. Had they met earlier, Nethan might have considered recruiting Jinbei, perhaps forging an alliance that spanned the oceans. But now that he had already brought down Sand Crocodile and Moonlight Mariah, and with Doflamingo fated to follow, chasing Jinbei held little strategic value. What truly mattered was maintaining firm control over Fishman Island and ensuring no one could challenge his claim there. "Thank you for saving His Royal Highness," Jinbei said, bowing his head, but there was steel in his voice. "I don't know what you intend to do here, but please don't cause any trouble. If you get yourself killed, the old man will personally come after you." Nethan gave him a wry smile. As a pirate who'd sneaked into Ryugu Castle, he was well aware how reckless his plan sounded. On the open sea, he'd have no trouble facing Rhodes's fleet, but on land, Surrounded by pirates with a combined bounty of 440 million berries, he wasn't so sure of victory. "Don't look at me like I'm the enemy," Nethan said, folding his arms. He studied Jinbei's calm, resolute expression for a long moment, then let his voice drop to ice. "Tell me this. If I offered you a captain's berth in the Ghost Hand Pirates, if you'd simply resign your post among the 7 warlords and join my crew, what would you say?" Jinbei's eyes widened. He shook his head firmly. "I'm honored by the offer, truly, but I can't accept. You've been kind to the prince, and I'll never forget that. Yet my duties as a warlord are the only shield standing between Fishman Island and its enemies." Nethan's lips curved in a slow, regretful smile. "A pity," he murmured, leaning back. He let his gaze wander to the vaulted ceiling, its mother-of-pearl inlays catching the torchlight, and spoke as if addressing the ornate dome itself. "Well, I suppose I'll just have to keep looking for volunteers." In the past, Nethan was so busy fending off one threat after another that he never had the luxury of looking ahead. But now, bolstered by his alliance with the Navy Admiral, his outlook has changed. What does he really want? To topple the 4 emperors? To discover the One Piece? Neither. Ever since he killed a celestial dragon in the Chambered Archipelago, Nethan has harbored a far grander ambition: to overthrow the world government itself. It's a goal that dwarfs even the challenge of defeating all 4 emperors and claiming the title of Pirate King. But Nethan has faith in his talent system. He's proven he can do the impossible. Someday, he envisions, he will shatter the Navy's authority and bring the world government to its knees. Then the Ghost Hand Pirates will cast off their pirate identity and rise as the new rulers of the world. Every officer aboard his ship will become a sovereign in their own right, one of 20 kings, mirroring the founders who established the world's first great government 800 years ago. He never speaks of this publicly. After all, it's still just a possibility, and the plan is only in its earliest stages. But Nethan knows where he's headed, and nothing will stop him from seeing it through. Chapter 160, First to Drink, Part 5. Robin hadn't returned to Ryugu Palace City. She'd followed Nethan's instructions to scour Fishman Island for the ancient stone tablets bearing its lost history. Neither Luffy nor Lafitte accompanied her, so Nethan found himself alone in the main hall. Before long, the great doors swung open, and a stately fishman with a gilded crown entered. It was King Neptune himself. The moment he appeared, Jinbei, though a respected sea knight and an officer of the new Fishman Pirates, immediately knelt and saluted, showing the utmost reverence. "My respects, your majesty," Jinbei said. Neptune offered a warm, fatherly smile. "Rise, Jinbei. No need for such formality." He turned his gaze to Nethan with genuine gratitude. "Lord Nethan, it's been too long since you graced Ryugu Palace. Word reached me of your courage in rescuing Prince Otoji. In your honor, I have prepared a banquet. Please allow us to show our thanks." Nethan waved off the offer. "Your Majesty, you're too kind. I only did what I had to. But what about Princess Shirahoshi? Where is she now?" King Neptune's expression softened. "She tried to hurry out to see you as soon as she heard your name, but I gently persuaded her to wait. She'll join us shortly. For the moment, my lord, you should rest and let your wound heal." With that, servants appeared to tend Nethan's injury, while Neptune took a seat at the dais, signaling that the banquet would soon begin. Though the hall lay silent for the moment, everyone in the room felt the warmth of the king's gratitude and the promise of a celebration yet to come. Nethan leaned back in his seat and offered a soft smile. "I'll be staying here in Ryugu Castle for a while longer, and I must say, the tea is exceptional." Standing quietly beside him, Lord Jinbei watched Nethan's every move with restrained concern. Ever since Neptune arrived on these shores, Jinbei had felt the palace's defenses grow steadier and his own anxieties ease. Still, he couldn't shake the worry that Nethan might linger too long in Dragon Palace City. A discreet word to Neptune ensured that the young adventurer's comings and goings would be watched, and Neptune, ever dutiful, readily agreed. A few days later, in the vast, lantern-lit gardens of Ryugu, 6-year-old mermaid princess Bai Shaoxing sat cross-legged on the emerald lawn. At her side crouched Robin, the 3-headed hellhound of the Devil's Triangle Sea. Despite her fearsome lineage, Robin's pups-like eyes and mischievous grin made her utterly adorable. Little Shaoxing, herself the living incarnation of the ancient weapon Sea King, found a kindred spirit in the dog. The two were inseparable. In affection, the princess had already nicknamed her Sister Robin. Not far off, Princess Otoji strolled along a moonlit path, the white bandages on her shoulders stark against her silken gown. She was almost fully healed. Just 2 days earlier, messengers from the Chambord Islands had delivered startling news. Nethin had slain a Tianlong warrior in a fierce duel with Admiral Hoshin, then departed as swiftly as he had arrived. The tale of his valor and sudden disappearance weighed heavily on Otoji's mind as she watched the playful pair in the garden below. Otohime, King Neptune, and Jinbei all stood frozen in shock. None of them had expected Nethin to move so boldly. He couldn't seriously be planning to kill a celestial dragon. Doing so would guarantee the world government's full-scale retaliation. It made no sense. Otohime pressed her palms together, urgency in her voice. "You can't do that. Killing a Tenryubito will only unleash the Navy and Marines on us. We'd be inviting the world government's wrath for no real gain." Nethin remained unnervingly calm. "I don't intend to kill him. At least, not yet. My goal is simply to anger the world government. Provoking them is the point, isn't it?" Her heart pounded. His resolve was as steely as the toughest fishman in the Sun Pirates. Otohime glanced at Neptune and Jinbei. They were just as stunned. She had no ready argument to top him. Then Nethin's gray eyes locked onto hers, and his voice dropped to a low, measured tone. "Your true plan," he said, "is to rescue the celestial dragons first, then secure their vote so the fishmen can live on land." Otohime's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't realized he saw right through her. She opened her mouth to protest, but he held up a hand, his expression turning almost awed. "Don't underestimate me, Otohime," he said deeply. "I know exactly what you're planning. Even if you secure the Tianlong Elder's signatures and win every Murloc's consent, how can you be sure that humans will treat Murlocs and mermen with the same respect you do?" Iji's eyes widened. Nethin's voice remained cold and steady. "Don't fool yourself by thinking that humans and Murlocs naturally understand one another. Not yet. Until you've built an unshakable defense to guarantee your people's safety, setting foot on human shorelines is nothing less than signing Fishman Island's death warrant." Otoji fell silent. Nethin's words struck her like a hammer blow, shattering the part of her heart she'd tried so hard to ignore. Could she really promise that humans, even if Murlocs and mermen embraced peace, would honor their word? Perhaps, but she could no more guarantee it than she could will the tides to stand still. To risk her people's lives on such uncertainty would be unforgivably reckless. Yet she reminded herself, Fishman Island wasn't defenseless. Jinping's power was renowned, and Baixing's abilities were nothing short of extraordinary. Still, without absolute strength and assurance, any step toward the surface could invite catastrophe. Nethin's tone grew gentle as he turned to watch Shirahoshi playing with Robin at the water's edge. A soft smile touched his lips. "Shirahoshi?" Eiji echoed, her voice barely more than a whisper. She'd expected Nethin to speak of sea kings. After all, legends on Fishman Island said the king alone could command those mighty leviathans. But never did she imagine a 6-year-old girl possessing that power. Nethin didn't hesitate to confirm what was already stirring in everyone's minds. Legends say that once every generation, a mermaid princess is born who can summon and guide the sea kings with her voice. He explained, meeting Eiji's stunned gaze. "Shirahoshi is that princess." Eiji stood frozen, eyes wide as she watched Shirahoshi from afar. She remembered how close the little princess had come to revealing her ability before, only for Eiji herself to suppress it. Now, faced with the truth, she wondered if it had been wise to keep such a gift hidden. Perhaps some secrets were better left untouched, at least until the world was ready. Nethin cut Otohime off mid-sentence. He turned to face her directly. "You already know what Shirahoshi's power means," he said quietly. "I don't need to explain it." A bead of sweat glimmered on Otohime's forehead as she stared at her daughter. After a long moment, the queen drew in a steadying breath and met Nethin's gaze. She nodded once, firmly. "That settles it," she said. "We'll stop gathering those pointless signatures. From now on, our sole task is to protect Shirahoshi. This isn't just about Fishman Island's safety, it's about the entire world." Nethin's expression softened into a small, knowing smile. Exactly. Otohime fell silent, but inside her a new determination took root. In time, she would challenge the world government and secure Fishman Island's rightful standing among the seas. As for Nethan, he had no need to announce his own ambition to one day become one of the four emperors, so long as Otohime understood Shirahoshi's true importance. Until now, her kindness and belief in peaceful coexistence had blinded her to the stakes at hand. Whether they would ever call on Shirahoshi's tremendous power was a decision for the future. For today, they had a princess to protect and a world to save.